Welcome back, my friends. Settle in and enjoy the stories. Nothing here will wake you. Sleep well. Winter darkness changes distance in Rocky Mountain National Park. A headlamp visible across a basin can look close enough to reach, while a nearby ridge disappears completely in blowing snow. I had worked high country rescues for 11 years before I learned that light itself could become lost. The incident began when Mara and Joel Kessler failed to return from an overnight trip above Bear Lake. They were experienced winter hikers carrying snowshoes, avalanche transceivers, shelter, and a satellite messenger. Their route crossed a broad alpine basin below Flattop Mountain before returning through the trees. Their permit described conservative turnaround times and alternate routes below treeline. Both had completed avalanche training, and Joel had worked on a volunteer mountain rescue unit years earlier. Nothing in their plans suggested an attempt on technical terrain or an intentional climb after dark. A fast storm arrived earlier than forecast. Wind erased tracks within minutes and pushed snow across every exposed slope. Their messenger transmitted a routine position near treeline, then a second position several hundred feet higher. The final transmission contained a photograph instead of text. The image showed Joel standing beside a rock wall with his headlamp pointed toward the camera. A pale column extended upward from the lamp, crossed the dark sky, and appeared to continue behind the ridge. A second column stood farther uphill where no person was visible. Image metadata placed the camera within a few yards of the final messenger position. The exposure lasted only a fraction of a second, too short for a moving headlamp to draw a long streak. Both columns existed in the scene rather than being created by a camera motion. No editing software had touched the file, and the original remained stored inside the messenger. Whatever Mara photographed had been present before the transmission left the mountain. Mara had captured the image shortly before midnight. Their messenger remained connected long enough to upload it, then stopped responding. By dawn, snowfall and wind had buried any surface trail they left behind. Weather prevented aircraft from entering the basin. Clouds covered the ridges, and gusts created whiteout conditions above treeline. The search would begin on foot, with every team prepared to remain outside through another night. An evacuation from that elevation could require many hours. Each team carried enough insulation to protect both rescuers and patients during a prolonged stop. Cold batteries, frozen medical equipment, and buried roots were treated as expected problems rather than surprises. My group included Ranger Elise Navarro, a medic and avalanche technician, and Dr. Aaron Bell, an atmospheric researcher assigned to a climate station nearby. Aaron joined because the photograph resembled a light pillar, an optical effect produced when flat ice crystals reflect a strong light source. Light pillars normally appear as vertical shafts above the sun, moon, streetlights, or other bright sources. The light is not actually inside the column. Countless small crystals act like suspended mirrors, sending reflections toward the observer from different heights. They are most convincing when cold air remains calm enough for plate-shaped crystals to settle nearly level. A mountain basin can briefly create those conditions between violent gusts. The same wind that causes whiteout may stop behind a ridge and leave a layer of crystals hanging almost motionless. That explanation accounted for the column above Joel. It did not explain the second one. No trail, building, vehicle, or known search team occupied the slope where it appeared. We left Bear Lake before afternoon with snowshoes, rope, a rescue sled, emergency shelter, medical oxygen, avalanche equipment, and redundant navigation tools. Aaron carried a weather meter, a spectrometer, and camera filters used to study reflected light. Our primary route stayed on terrain protected by trees and rock ribs. The direct line to the messenger position was shorter, but crossed slopes where fresh wind slab could release. A missing person did not justify creating additional victims. Before entering exposed terrain, we synchronized every camera and recorded the serial numbers of our lamps. Command logged when each light was switched on or off. If reflections multiplied our positions, the timeline would help separate real rescuers from optical copies. We photographed each beam against a calibration card before departure. White search lamps, red navigation lights, and emergency strobes produced different spectral patterns. Aaron expected those signatures to identify the source of any reflection captured later. At sunset, the wind stopped with unnatural speed. Ice crystals drifted through the beam of my headlamp. A white column rose above Elise, then another above Aaron. Farther up the basin, 4 additional columns appeared and began moving toward the ridge. The crystals looked like silver dust falling through still air. They made no sound against our clothing and accumulated slowly on exposed equipment. The temperature dropped while the calm deepened, isolating the basin from the wind roaring over the ridge above. We held position inside the last trees and counted again. 3 people stood in our group, but 7 shafts of light occupied the basin. The nearest columns matched our movements. When I turned my head, one tilted slightly before returning to vertical. The distant 4 did not copy us. They advanced uphill at a steady walking pace, crossing a snowfield too steep for anyone to climb that quickly. No bodies, shadows, or footprints appeared beneath them. Distance collapsed around the lights. One moment they seemed close to the nearest trees. The next they appeared beyond the upper ridge without changing size. Binoculars revealed no equipment, clothing, or snow disturbed by travel beneath them. Aaron rotated a polarizing filter in front of his camera. The columns above our lamps dimmed and brightened as the filter turned. Reflected light often changes under polarization. The distant columns responded in the same way, proving that they were reflections of something. We repeated the test from separated positions and recorded the filter angle each time. Our own pillars weakened predictably. 2 distant columns vanished at different angles for each observer, confirming that their apparent locations depended on viewpoint rather than a fixed object on the snow. The source remained unknown. We blocked our lamps one at a time while Command recorded the results. Each nearby pillar vanished with its matching light. The 4 uphill columns continued moving after every lamp in our team was covered. We switched to low red lights, which produced weaker reflections and preserved night vision. The distant columns faded, but did not disappear. Their color remained white, showing that our lamps were not creating them. Command confirmed that no other team had entered the upper basin. Trailhead vehicles faced away from the mountain, and their lights were off. The nearest building remained hidden behind several ridges, removing the obvious artificial sources from consideration. Civilian hikers had also been stopped at the trailhead after the storm warning. No untracked party was expected above us. Elise checked avalanche conditions before we left the trees. Fresh wind slab had formed on several aspects, while the route marked by the columns crossed beneath a loaded slope. Following them directly would have violated every safe approach we had planned. We climbed a forested rib instead, using compass bearings and elevation readings rather than visual targets. The lights remained visible through gaps in the trees. Each time we gained height, their positions changed more than the terrain allowed. Snowshoe travel slowed as drifts deepened. We checked each other for cold injury and altitude symptoms at regular intervals. The pillars encouraged us to rush, so fixed medical and navigation stops became part of resisting them. That movement was partly an effect of viewing geometry. A light pillar has no fixed distance because it consists of reflections along a line of sight. As our angle changed, the apparent column could slide across the landscape without any source moving. The explanation helped until one column passed behind a boulder. A true atmospheric reflection should have vanished where rock blocked our view. Instead, the light crossed the stone face and emerged above it, as if the boulder had become transparent. I moved several steps sideways to test the obstruction. The column remained attached to the boulder from my viewpoint while sliding into open air from Aaron's. We could no longer agree on which side of the rock contained the light. Our cameras recorded the event from 3 angles. On Aaron's screen, the column disappeared correctly. On my body camera, it remained visible across the rock. Elisa's recording showed it split into 2 narrower shafts. That disagreement damaged our confidence more than a shared hallucination would have. Digital cameras can expose weak light differently, but all 3 devices had synchronized clocks and overlapping fields of view. The files proved that the same scene could produce 3 incompatible versions of where the column existed. We marked our location and continued by instruments. Joel's last messenger position lay near a shallow saddle beyond the rib. Reaching it required another hour through deep snow, even though the nearest false light seemed only a few yards ahead. At the saddle, we found a backpack standing upright in the snow. Its headlamp was clipped to a strap and switched off. A pale column rose from it anyway. No tracks approached the pack from its uphill side. Wind had softened the prints below, but the snow beyond remained smooth. The column suggested that someone had continued upward even though every physical clue indicated movement in the opposite direction. The pack belonged to Joel. Snow filled the open main compartment, but the contents had been removed deliberately. His insulated jacket was gone, along with the emergency shelter and medical kit. He had not dropped the pack during a fall. I opened the headlamp battery case. The batteries were missing. Ice coated the lens, and no electrical source remained inside the housing. Aaron's meter detected reflected white light with the same spectral pattern as our lamps, although none was shining on the pack. The missing batteries were found inside a warm pocket of the pack, wrapped in cloth to preserve their charge. Joel had removed them deliberately. His action suggested that the lamp produced something he wanted to stop, yet the column remained anchored above its empty housing. The pillar disappeared when I covered the lens with black tape. That result suggested the headlamp still mattered, but not as a source. It behaved more like a marker that the drifting crystals recognized and extended into the sky. When I removed the tape, the column returned gradually from the bottom upward. Aaron recorded the sequence at high speed. Individual points of light appeared at different heights, then joined into a continuous shaft above the empty lamp. Joel's camera was stored in a padded pocket. Its final video showed both hikers crossing the saddle during heavy snow. 3 lights moved between the trees below them. Believing a search team had arrived, they changed direction and descended toward the lights. Frame-by-frame review revealed that the lights never touched the terrain. Trees passed in front of some columns and behind others within the same sequence. The camera kept changing focus as if it could not determine whether the reflections were close snow crystals or distant lamps. The final frames showed Mara and Joel casting shadows away from a light behind the camera. No third person appeared there. The illumination lasted several seconds and disappeared before either hiker turned around. The video contained no clear speech after wind overwhelmed the microphone. It showed Mara pointing toward another group of lights farther uphill. Within minutes they appeared surrounded by rescuers who never came close enough to reveal a body. Joel had recorded his compass several times. The apparent teams occupied different bearings even when the camera remained still. Some lights descended through solid rock. Others moved above the snow without illuminating it. His navigation log ended with coordinates written inside the pack lid. They placed him lower than the saddle when he removed the batteries. He had left the pack as a visible marker, then crawled downslope toward protected terrain. Elise activated her avalanche transceiver in search mode. A weak signal appeared below the saddle, then vanished. We spread out on a rope and repeated the sweep. The signal returned near a wind-loaded hollow outside the route suggested by the pillars. We descended one at a time, probing for hidden drops. The signal strengthened beneath a shallow drift beside exposed willow. Joel lay inside a collapsed emergency shelter, partly buried by snow that had blown over its entrance. The shelter occupied a depression invisible from the saddle. None of the pillars had appeared above it until we entered transceiver range. He was conscious but confused, with a badly injured ankle and early hypothermia. His headlamp rested beneath his jacket, where no light escaped. A white pillar stood above the shelter and followed the rhythm of the lamp's emergency pulse. Each pulse appeared above the drift before light escaped through any opening we could see. Aaron covered the shelter with an opaque tarp, but the column continued for several cycles. It stopped only after Elise switched off the lamp beneath Joel's clothing. Elise stabilized the ankle, insulated him from the snow, and began controlled warming. We limited his movements and assessed for additional trauma. His transceiver and the shelter had kept him detectable after visual searching became useless. Joel communicated that Mara had left to reach lights she believed were rescuers. He had tried to follow until his ankle failed. The last direction he indicated led above the saddle toward avalanche terrain and a corniced ridge. We requested another team to evacuate Joel along our protected rib. Elise remained until they arrived. Aaron and I prepared to search uphill, where every visible light offered the most dangerous route on the mountain. Before separating, we exchanged redundant coordinates and established a missed contact procedure. If either group lost radio communication, no one would follow a lamp to reconnect. Each team would remain on its planned route until the next scheduled transmission. Before leaving Joel, we created a rule stricter than ordinary night navigation. No light could influence our route unless it illuminated nearby snow, cast a measurable shadow, and agreed with map, compass, and elevation. A bright point without those three properties was treated as empty sky. We also required both of us to confirm every movement before releasing an anchor. Cold, fatigue, and altitude already impair judgment. The pillars added a visual command that felt urgent, even when we understood it was false. We attached opaque hoods to our lamps, directing narrow beams only at our feet. The change reduced pillars above us. It also made the distant lights brighter by comparison, as though darkness supplied them with contrast. I placed a strip of reflective tape across Aaron's shoulder and another on my pack. Those markers responded only when struck by our beams. Unlike the pillars, they gave us a reliable way to confirm a nearby human shape without using an exposed lamp. Mara's transceiver signal appeared intermittently uphill. Each burst lasted several seconds and shifted farther north than a walking person could travel. Snow and rock can distort a radio signal, but not by the distances our display suggested. We placed the receiving unit directly on the snow and compared distance readings from several orientations. Reflections from rock altered the arrow, while the minimum distance remained more reliable. That number guided our grid, even when the apparent direction pointed toward a moving column. We ignored the direction arrow and worked a course grid along safe terrain. Rope protected every crossing, and a run marked our track with wands placed close enough to remain visible under red light. We never stepped toward a column merely because it looked near. Each wand carried a number and compass bearing. If blowing snow buried one, the sequence still revealed our intended direction. The fixed markers provided a physical route that shifting light could not rewrite. We photographed every marker after placement, preserving a second record of the route if wind removed the wands completely. The first grid line ended at the base of a steep snowfield. 5 pillars stood across it like people holding lanterns. None created brightness on the ground. When I swept my lamp across them, their apparent bodies remained empty. A quick snow test found a stiff slab resting on weaker grains. The false group occupied the most direct line across it. Their arrangement resembled rescuers spacing themselves safely, making the dangerous route look professionally chosen. A 6th light appeared lower on the slope. It cast a faint blue shadow from a rock and brightened the blowing snow immediately around it. Those physical effects proved that a source existed near the surface. The safest route approached from the side rather than below. We crossed a band of exposed stone, built an anchor, and entered the slope on belay. The transceiver stabilized as soon as we reached the line of the blue shadow. Halfway across, a pillar appeared directly beside Aaron. It resembled my hooded lamp in color and height, yet my actual position remained behind him. He turned toward the copy and shifted 1 foot before the rope stopped him. The step would have placed his weight on a hollow section above a concealed drop. My dad. We retreated to the anchor and approached from higher rock. The false light remained beside the weak snow until our angle changed, then slid toward the cornice. Mara lay inside a narrow gap between 2 boulders. Her headlamp was buried beneath several inches of wind-packed snow, still operating on low power. The light had traveled through the snow and crystals, creating a pillar visible from below while hiding her body completely. Her tracks showed repeated changes of direction around the boulders. Each turn aligned with a different pillar captured by her helmet camera. She had been circling the same outcrop while believing she was approaching separate groups of people. She had severe hypothermia, frost injury on one hand, and a deep cut along her scalp. Her pulse remained present. We sealed her inside insulation, applied heat around her torso, controlled the bleeding, and prepared a low-angle extraction. Her transceiver log showed repeated changes in distance without corresponding movement. She had used it in search mode, apparently believing the false lights belonged to Joel. Reflected radio signals and moving optical columns had reinforced the same wrong direction. Above us, the cornice began to crack. At least a dozen columns assembled along its edge, all moving toward the place where we had anchored the rescue rope. The crack traveled across the cornice without releasing it. Fresh snow settled from the overhang in thin streams. Our approach rope crossed beneath the weakest section, so returning the same way would expose Mara and both rescuers to a collapse. I studied the map under my jacket while Arun monitored the slope. A broken rock band continued west toward the saddle. It offered slower travel, but stone would support anchors and keep us away from the loaded snowfield. We committed to the traverse before conditions worsened. The rock band contained short vertical steps hidden by drifted snow. I cleared each anchor's surface with a tool, checked for loose blocks, and backed up every natural placement. Speed mattered, but a failed anchor would have dropped the sled into the same slope we were avoiding. Mara was secured inside a compact rescue sled with insulation beneath and around her. We kept her horizontal and avoided unnecessary movement. Arun managed the litter while I built short rope systems from one rock horn to the next. We monitored her pulse and breathing at every anchor transition. Warming a severely cold patient during movement requires restraint. Heat remained concentrated around her torso while her limbs stayed insulated and undisturbed. The pillars followed our progress. Some gathered above abandoned anchors after we removed the rope. Others appeared ahead, copying the height and color of our hooded lamps. None matched the position reported by command for the incoming evacuation team. Daindarao. Radio discipline became essential. But every contact included coordinates, elevation, and route direction. We stopped using visible light as an identifier. A rescuer who announced a lamp position could unknowingly direct another team toward a reflection suspended over dangerous terrain. Command assigned a spoken number to each verified team and repeated it with every position report. When a column appeared where Elise's group should have been, the coordinates proved they were still below the saddle. The light was separated from them by an entire ridge. Near the saddle, wind returned in a sudden wave. The ice crystals scattered, and most columns vanished. Visibility dropped to several yards, but the disappearance made navigation easier. We followed our compass bearing in wands without false landmarks competing for attention. Blowing snow risked the upper halves of several markers within minutes. We shortened the distance between anchors and kept one rescuer clipped to the sled at all times. Losing sight of the next wand no longer meant losing the route. 3 columns remained inside the blowing snow. They moved parallel to us at the same pace, occasionally crossing our route. Aaron's spectrometer showed white light rich in the wavelengths produced by modern LEDs, even though our lamps remained shielded and red. Each surviving column brightened when the wind briefly weakened. Their spacing matched our 3-person group before we reached Mara. After she was placed in the sled, a 4th column appeared and remained level with her covered headlamp. The evacuation team reached Joel and began lowering him through the trees. Elise then climbed to meet us with 2 additional rescuers, a larger sled, and medical oxygen. We confirmed their identities by radio before any lamp became visible. Mara's temperature rose slowly after oxygen and additional warming. We transferred her sled without exposing her to the wind. The combined team descended the forested rib using belays, snow anchors, and controlled braking rather than attempting the shorter open slope. No aircraft entered the basin. Wind and cloud continued until morning. Joel reached the trailhead first, followed by Mara several hours later. Every lamp, camera, transceiver, and weather instrument went into evidence storage before batteries were removed. We also preserved snow crystals in insulated containers, photographed anchor stations, and downloaded instrument clocks before they drifted. The sequence mattered because any later explanation depended on matching each visible column to a possible source at the same second. Nothing was corrected or renamed in the field. Original files remained locked, while duplicate copies were used for analysis. At sunrise, the clouds briefly opened above Flattop Mountain. The search teams were already below tree line. 4 pale columns continued climbing toward the ridge, exactly where the first photograph had shown them. Daylight should have overwhelmed any weak reflection from a headlamp. The columns remained visible for nearly a minute against the brightening sky. Then the wind reached the basin, and all 4 disappeared at the same instant. Mara and Joel survived. Joel required surgery for his ankle, while Mara spent several days under observation for hypothermia and frost injury. Both recovered well enough to return for the investigation later that year. Their account matched the recordings. They saw lights approaching through snowfall and assumed another party had reported their delay. Each apparent rescuer remained just beyond visibility. Following one light led to another until the siblings no longer knew which direction returned to the trail. Both remembered a growing certainty that the lights recognized them. When they stopped, the nearest column stopped. When they turned away, new ones appeared ahead. That behavior could result from changing viewing angles, but knowledge of the mechanism did not reduce its psychological force. Weather data confirmed an unusually cold, moist layer trapped inside the basin during calm intervals. Flat ice crystals could have reflected headlamps, creating pillars whose apparent positions changed with the observer. Strong winds between intervals then erased tracks and redistributed snow. Microscopy found plate crystals and tapped columns in the preserved samples. Their shape supported the optical model. Wind instruments also recorded sharp calm periods inside the basin, while exposed stations above it continued measuring powerful gusts. Most of the recorded lights received ordinary explanations. Our own lamps produced several pillars. Joel and Mara produced others. Light from the trailhead and a maintenance vehicle may have reflected above distant ridges, appearing inside terrain that blocked the sources from view. Investigators reconstructed every known beam using terrain models and observer positions. Their simulation produced columns that slid across slopes, changed apparent distance, and vanished behind rock. The results closely matched much of our footage. Computer reconstruction explained why a column seemed to cross a boulder on one camera. The reflection formed between the camera and the rock, not behind it. Exposure differences made the same weak light disappear from Arun's footage and split across Elise's sensor. That explanation was physically sound and supported by later tests. It also demonstrated why the event was dangerous. A reflection with no fixed distance could appear to occupy terrain even when every observer saw it somewhere different. 7 columns remained unmatched. They appeared after every recorded lamp had been covered or switched off. Their spectra resembled white leads, but no source occupied the required angles. 4 moved uphill faster than a person while preserving equal spacing. The unmatched group also reacted to our stops. Its movement paused during medical checks and resumed when we climbed. No optical model required a reflection to mirror the timing of observers while moving independently across the terrain. The batteryless headlamp on Joel's pack caused the longest disagreement. Investigators proposed that its frozen lens redirected distant light into the crystals. Laboratory tests created a faint vertical smear, but nothing as bright as the column documented at the saddle. Search procedures changed after the review. Winter teams began using lamp hoods, synchronized light logs, and red illumination in ice crystal conditions. Any suspected human light required confirmation through ground illumination, shadow, radio contact, navigation data, or transceiver signal. Training exercises showed how quickly even experienced rescuers followed a light that seemed to wait for them. Teams performed better when one member navigated without looking uphill, and another monitored optical targets. Separating those duties reduced the urge to correct a safe route toward an apparent person. The following winter, a controlled test returned to the basin. Every powered lamp remained sealed inside opaque containers until the team reached marked stations. Weather instruments recorded the same cold layer, and cameras watched the route from several angles. Before the first lamp was opened, 4 white pillars appeared above the saddle. 3 stayed fixed over the places where our original team had stopped. The 4th descended the forested rib toward the researchers. The test team followed protocol and did not move toward it. Cameras confirmed that the descending column illuminated no trees and left no track. Near the final monitoring station, it stopped several yards from the observers and widened at ground level. All known power sources remained sealed, and the weather station recorded no change capable of explaining why that single column had descended. Only one of those columns illuminated the snow beneath it. It was also the only one that cast a human shadow. Biscayne National Park is mostly water. A ranger can spend an entire shift without touching a trail, yet still cross coral reefs, mangrove shorelines, shallow banks, and the remains of ships lost long before the park existed. I had patrolled those waters for 13 years when the bay began drawing vessels of its own. The first report came from Kira and Owen Hale, siblings assisting a university survey of seagrass near the Maritime Heritage Trail. Their flat skiff carried charts, life jackets, a marine radio, emergency signals, and a satellite tracker. Both had worked on boats since childhood and knew the park's shallow water. They planned to finish before sunset. At dusk, the tracker showed them turning west from an offshore reef. Their speed then dropped below walking pace. The final positions formed a tight circle around a charted wreck before the signal stopped. Their float plan included fuel range, emergency contacts, hull description, and intended waypoints. Nothing suggested an overnight stop. The circular track was inconsistent with a direct return, but resembled a boat maneuvering around another vessel, or searching for a safe opening through shallow water. No distress call reached the park. Their emergency beacon remained silent, and neither mobile phone connected to shore. A family member reported them overdue after the skiff failed to return to its marina. Conditions appeared calm, but darkness made the bay dangerous. Depth can change quickly across banks and channels. A route that floats a boat at high tide may expose seagrass, coral, or rock several hours later. Recent wind had also shifted loose sediment across familiar cuts. Sophia reviewed updated notices and tide predictions before launch. We treated charted depth as a starting point rather than a guarantee, especially near the wreck where the tracker had stopped. I launched on a shallow draft patrol boat with Ranger Sofia Mendez at the helm. Dr. Jonah Reed joined us from a water quality crew working nearby. He carried sampling bottles, a fluorometer, low-light cameras, and instruments for measuring plankton density. Our boat carried radar, side-looking sonar, thermal imaging, medical oxygen, a rescue board, tow lines, and redundant radios. Command recorded our search legs and maintained contact with marine units outside the park. Every crew received the missing skiff's dimensions and color. We synchronized the low-light cameras with radar and sonar clocks before leaving the dock. Every apparent vessel would later be matched against physical returns. That record was intended to prevent duplicate searches in darkness, not document objects that existed on only one system. Crew assignments remained fixed. Sophia navigated, Jonah interpreted water behavior, and I coordinated search and medical response. Dividing those duties prevented any single bright target from pulling the entire crew away from verified information. The water had shown faint bioluminescence during the previous nights. Microscopic organisms can emit light when disturbed by waves, fish, paddles, or a moving hull. Most displays appear as scattered sparks or a soft glow along a wake. The chemical reaction lasts briefly and costs the organism energy. It does not produce a permanent trail. A bright shape, therefore, indicates recent disturbance, but its apparent edges can be extended by current or by animals entering the moving water. That night, every disturbance burned blue-green. Mullet drew bright lines beneath the surface. Our propeller left a luminous road across the bay, and droplets falling from the bow flashed before returning to darkness. Clouds covered the stars, and no moon separated sea from sky. The glow, therefore, became the brightest feature in every direction. It flattened distance and made a faint wake nearby appear as solid as a large vessel several hundred yards away. Our searchlights improved object recognition, but destroyed the weak contrast needed to study the glow. We used them only in short sweeps, then waited for our eyes and cameras to recover before judging another target. We reduced speed as we approached the siblings' final position. Sophia followed the chart and depth sounder rather than the glow around us. Reef and seagrass remained invisible beyond the narrow reach of our searchlight. Radar showed no vessel ahead. The thermal camera showed only warm water and several birds resting on exposed markers. Then a long blue outline appeared off our port side. The shape had at a bow 2 parallel gunwales and a squared stern. A luminous wake spread behind it as though a cabin boat were crossing the bay. Nothing occupied the space inside the outline. Low-light footage revealed darker rectangles where seats and a console should have been. Those spaces were not solid objects. They were areas where the plankton had not flashed, surrounded by water bright enough to make absence resemble structure. It passed between us and the reef without an engine sound, navigation light, radar return, or physical hull. The water had drawn a boat and sent it into the darkness ahead. Sophia stopped our engine before the empty vessel reached shallow water. Its wake continued at the same speed, bending around a marker that should have blocked any real hull. Blue light climbed the marker's post, then returned to the surface on the opposite side. Jonah lowered a sampling bottle into the glow. The water contained dense concentrations of bioluminescent plankton, including dinoflagellates capable of producing light under mechanical stress. The organisms explained the color and brightness. They did not explain the shape. He compared the sample with water collected outside the outline. Plankton concentration was nearly identical. The vessel's shape had not formed from a separate patch of organisms. A patterned force had passed through the same water and activated only selected areas. Bioluminescence reveals motion rather than creating it. A fish, paddle, current boundary, or pressure wave must disturb the organisms first. The hull-shaped outline meant something had moved through the water, even if our instruments detected no object. We recorded its position, heading, and speed. The phantom wake crossed the reef line and continued over water too shallow for its apparent draft. Its stern narrowed gradually before the entire shape went dark. Sophia released a small, instrumented drifter beside our boat. Its movement confirmed the surface current and provided a physical reference on radar. The Phantom crossed the drifter's path without changing either course, showing that no displacement hull had passed. Another vessel appeared near the tracker circle. This one resembled a long sailing ship seen from above. 3 narrow bands of light marked where masts might have disturbed the surface, although no masts rose into the air. The second shape followed the outline of a documented wreck beneath it. Current flowing across exposed timbers could create turbulence resembling the original hull. That explanation gave us a physical source and a reason for the vessel's dimensions. Sonar displayed ribs, ballast, and scattered fasteners beneath the glow. Water accelerated through gaps in the wreck and slowed behind them, producing lines that roughly matched the lost ship's structure. The bloom transformed hydrodynamics into a visible reconstruction. Then the glowing ship detached from the wreck and moved into open water. Sonar continued, showing the wreck behind it. The shape traveled east while the measured tide moved west. We established a search rule immediately. No luminous outline would be treated as a vessel without confirmation from radar, sonar, navigation lights, radio contact, or direct illumination. The bay could show us motion, but it could no longer identify what caused it. Jonah classified the shapes by decay, symmetry, and relation to current. Fish trails changed direction sharply. Wreck turbulence remained fixed to the bottom. A true powered vessel produced pressure at the bow and an expanding wake behind it. Several outlines fit none of those categories. Those unclassified shapes maintained hull proportions while turning. Their apparent bows changed direction first, followed by a curved wake. The motion suggested steering even though no rudder, propeller, or pressure displacement appeared on our instruments. Kira and Owen's tracker circle lay above broken reef and scattered wreck material. We approached at idle speed, using the chart and depth sounder. Several bright wakes crossed our course, but none produced a solid return. A floating equipment case appeared inside one of the outlines. Its orange lid carried the university survey label. The case was closed, undamaged, and attached to a short length of severed line. Inside were water samples, field notes, a spare radio battery, and a camera card sealed against moisture. Their timestamps ended shortly before the tracker began circling. Nothing suggested that Kira or Owen intended to abandon the case. The camera card contained a sequence of the glowing patrol boat they followed. Its profile copied our park vessels closely, including a raised bow rail and equipment box. No registration number, crew member, or navigation light appeared when the images were enlarged. One frame showed the false vessel crossing directly over the charted wreck. Its outline remained on the surface while sonar taken later placed solid structure below. The image contained 2 ships occupying different depths and different centuries. The water around it glowed in the shape of the missing skiff. For several seconds, seats, console, and outboard seemed visible as negative spaces inside the light. When we reached the case, every part of the imagined boat vanished, except the drifting box. Measurements showed the outline moving faster than the case and in a different direction. The physical object had not created the complete image. It occupied the center only by coincidence, making the empty vessel look more convincing. The siblings had been there. The bay had preserved the shape of their vessel after the vessel itself moved or sank. We searched the tracker circle using expanding legs plotted on the chart. Sophia maintained idle speed to protect the reef and anyone in the water. I monitored radar and thermal imaging while Jonah watched the glow with a low-light camera. Whenever a phantom wake crossed a planned leg, we held course unless solid evidence required a change. This prevented repeated diversion toward bright targets. Command could see our grid filling normally even while the water appeared crowded with boats. The missing skiff appeared on sonar beside the wreck. It lay upside down in a depression, its bow resting against coral rubble. No human-sized returns remained beneath it. Air trapped beneath the hull produced a strong return that initially resembled a second vessel. We examined the target from several angles before approaching. A diver would not enter until surface hazards and possible entanglement were understood. We anchored outside the damaged area and approached with a small, inflatable rescue board. Fresh scrape marks showed where the skiff had crossed shallow rock before capsizing. One life jacket remained trapped beneath the console. The fuel tank was intact, and no collision with another vessel had occurred. A bent propeller and fractured lower unit indicated a high-speed grounding. Kira and Owen had accelerated toward something they believed was a clear route, or another boat. Fragments from the lower unit formed a straight line toward the tracker circle. Their orientation showed the skiff had turned sharply just before impact. The maneuver aligned with the Phantom patrol boat later visible on the recovered camera card. Their emergency beacon was still mounted beneath the overturned hull, where they could not reach it. The marine radio had separated from its bracket and flooded. The failed distress equipment explained the silence, but not where the siblings had gone. We found Owen by accident. Jonah noticed a blue pulse beside a mooring buoy, separate from the random flashes of fish. It appeared twice, stopped, then returned when a hand moved beneath the surface. Owen had wrapped one arm through the buoy line and kept the rest of his body motionless. Every attempt to swim made the water around him flare brightly, attracting his attention to phantom wakes and destroying his night vision. Remaining still also reduced heat loss and conserved energy. His life jacket kept his airway above the surface, while the buoy fixed his location against the tide. That decision mattered more than any visual signal he could have produced. He was exhausted, cold, and suffering from a deep cut along one leg. I secured him to the rescue board, controlled the bleeding, and brought him to the patrol boat without placing weight on the reef. Sophia provided oxygen and dry insulation while Jonah documented Owen's condition. Why? He remained alert enough to communicate by gestures and short answers, but we limited questions until his breathing and temperature improved. His leg wound required pressure, irrigation, and immobilization before transport. Saltwater exposure and continued movement had increased bleeding. We recorded his core temperature and the exact time he left the water for later treatment decisions. Bioluminescent water covered his clothing and flashed whenever fabric shifted. Rinsing reduced the light but did not remove it completely. For several minutes, his outline remained visible through the insulating blanket as a faint blue pulse. His account later established the sequence. The siblings saw what looked like a ranger vessel signaling from the wreck. They followed its blue wake, struck the reef, and entered the water when the skiff overturned. Their recovered camera showed no navigation lights on the apparent patrol boat. Bioluminescence outlined a familiar hull and made it seem official. Under stress, the siblings supplied the missing details from expectation and followed without radio confirmation. Owen reached the buoy. Kira inflated their emergency raft and paddled toward another glowing patrol boat that appeared to wait beyond the reef. She carried a life jacket, whistle, waterproof light, and the remaining handheld beacon. Wind would have pushed the raft south, while the ebb tide carried it toward mangroves farther north. Her partial beacon position lay between those influences. That geometry narrowed the search more reliably than any luminous wake. We projected several drift scenarios and eliminated those crossing exposed banks. A lightweight raft could pass over water too shallow for our boat, which explained why Kira's path entered terrain we could not follow directly. The tide had been falling for more than an hour. If Kira followed the false vessel, she was drifting toward a maze of shallow banks and mangrove channels, where our patrol boat could not safely follow its speed. We transferred Owen to a second patrol boat arriving from the mainland. Its crew confirmed their identity by radio before entering our search area. Their real wake glowed as brightly as the false ones, but radar, navigation lights, and engine noise fixed the vessel to a physical position. The receiving crew logged Owen's condition and continued treatment during transport. Their departure created a fresh, luminous trail that several phantom wakes merged into. Within minutes, the direction of the real boat could no longer be identified from glow alone. Jonah used the bloom as a current tracer. Instead of following the shapes that resembled boats, he studied how individual sparks stretched and faded. The true ebb flow carried disturbed water west and north toward a narrow passage through the mangroves. He compared those movements with wind, tide predictions, and the drifter. All three agreed on the likely path of an unpowered raft. The method produced a search corridor grounded in physical transport, rather than the apparent heading of a glowing hull. Kira's handheld beacon transmitted one incomplete position before failing. The coordinates placed her near the mouth of that passage. A phantom wake crossed the same point moments later, traveling inland against the current. The beacon's last packet also contained low battery voltage and no movement after transmission. It may have failed underwater. We treated the coordinate as the beginning of a shoreline search rather than proof that Kira remained there. Before entering, we marked the tide level on a mangrove trunk and calculated how much depth we would lose during the search. That measurement defined a hard turnaround time even if Kira remained unfound. We could not determine whether she had followed it. Sophia entered the channel at idle speed, then raised the motor when the depth sounder warned of submerged routes. We continued with push poles and the rescue board tethered behind us. The patrol boat's shallow draft gave us only inches of margin as the tide fell. Sophia marked every turn on the plotter and checked depth from both bow and stern. A channel wide enough to enter might become too narrow to leave. Bioluminescence transformed the mangroves into a false map. Dot, dot. Fish created glowing branches beneath the surface. Falling leaves produced expanding rings. Every stroke of a pole opened a blue path that persisted long enough to resemble another channel. We navigated by compass, charted shoreline, tide, and measured depth. The most inviting luminous routes often ended beneath solid mangrove roots. Following them would have grounded the boat or trapped a rescuer inside the trees. Kira's raft appeared near a bend, caught upside down on a root. A bright, human-sized trail led away from it through the water. The trail separated into several branches, each moving independently. Schools of small fish had entered the turbulence she left behind. Their movements extended and multiplied her path after she was gone. The brightest branch therefore represented the most fish, not necessarily the direction Kira traveled. We distinguished the original trail by decay. Older disturbance produced diffuse light that faded uniformly, while fish created sharp flashes with abrupt turns. The weakest branch along the mangrove edge matched the time since Kira left the raft. We searched for evidence the fish could not imitate. Scraped bark, broken leaves, fabric fibers, and water, displaced above the normal tide line, indicated that Kira had climbed along the mangrove edge rather than swimming into the channel. Her whistle sounded once from beyond the next bend. Wind and vegetation made the direction uncertain, but the pulse disturbed roosting birds and created movement visible on thermal imaging. We followed that physical reaction instead of the sound alone. We stopped and waited through a full listening interval before moving. No second whistle came, but the displaced birds settled near one section of mangrove. Their behavior gave us a bounded area without requiring us to guess through reflected sound. Whoa. Thermal imaging then detected a small warm interruption among cooler leaves. It appeared only when the branches moved. Combining both clues placed Kira beyond the next bend rather than deeper inside the luminous channel. Kira was wedged between two mangrove trunks with her feet in the water. She had secured her life jacket to a branch before losing the strength to climb higher. The handheld beacon hung from its strap beneath the surface. She responded slowly but followed instructions. We supported her neck, inspected for injuries, and used a short haul line to move her onto the rescue board. Her wet clothing was removed only after sheltering her from wind and spray. We reached her alive, but the falling tide had removed enough water to prevent our patrol boat from turning around. Behind us, 3 glowing vessels entered the narrow channel in a line. The approaching shapes filled the passage from root to root. One resembled our patrol boat closely enough to show the console and raised motor as dark spaces inside the glow. Radar showed nothing, and the mangrove canopy blocked a useful view from outside teams. The copy repeated our earlier turns in reverse order, including a hesitation at one shallow bend. It looked less like a vessel approaching than the water replaying the route we had taken to enter the channel. Sophia shut down every powered light except a shielded red medical lamp. Hawaiʻi. Jonah watched the water through the low-light camera while I moved Kira onto the rescue board. Her pulse was rapid, her skin cool, and salt water had irritated several cuts. Starting the motor would have damaged seagrass and risked striking submerged wood in the falling water. We used poles to reverse along our recorded track. Each rescuer remained clipped to the boat because a single step beyond the channel could drop into soft sediment or a hidden hole. One pole sank without resistance near the port side, revealing a deep root cavity. Sophia shifted the boat using the opposite bank and kept the rescue board centered. Kira remained insulated above the deck rather than exposed to the glowing water. The phantom vessels passed through us without force. Their blue outlines crossed the hull, equipment and Kira's covered body. The water flashed along every wet surface, then returned to darkness without leaving damage. For several seconds, the copy and our real boat occupied the same outline. Low-light footage showed 2 consoles and 2 bows, while radar displayed only 1 hull. The false wake emerged ahead of us and continued reversing through the channel. Its passage activated water inside, sealed storage wells, and along the raised deck. Mechanical disturbance from outside could not easily reach those places. Jonah collected the glowing residue for comparison with the surrounding bloom. Their wakes did create a real hazard. The brightness erased our night vision and concealed roots beneath a continuous sheet of light. We stopped whenever a shape crossed, waited for the glow to decay, and resumed only after the depth sounder and poles agreed. Our outgoing track had been stored as coordinates rather than a visual trail. Sophia followed those points in reverse while I called distances from the bow. The method felt slow, but it prevented the luminous channels from rewriting our route. The second patrol boat monitored our progress from deeper water and kept its searchlights shielded. We reported each bend and depth change. If our boat grounded, their crew could approach by smaller craft along the same verified corridor. At the passage mouth, water deepened enough to lower the motor. We kept idle speed until the sounder showed a safe channel, then met the second patrol boat outside the shallow bank. Medical staff transferred Kira, without interrupting warming or oxygen. The receiving crew used a covered gangway and secured both boats before moving her. Their navigation lights, radar return, engine vibration, and radio identity satisfied every confirmation rule. No one crossed toward a shape based only on glow. Kira's temperature and breathing improved during transport, but she remained confused by lights outside the cabin. We blocked the windows so additional wakes could not interfere with her orientation or treatment. Both survivors reached the mainland by water. No helicopter entered the operation, and no high-speed chase followed the phantom boats. Charts, tide knowledge, shallow water handling, and evidence-based navigation brought us out. Every glowing vessel emerged from the mangroves behind us. Low-light cameras recorded 6 distinct hull shapes crossing the bay. Only 2 physical patrol boats appeared on radar. The last shape followed our course to the park dock. It stopped outside the harbor entrance, where bioluminescence normally faded beneath artificial light. Its outline remained visible until sunrise. Before leaving the boat, we preserved camera cards, radar logs, sonar files, tide readings, tracker positions, water samples, and the exact time of every engine movement. The bay had produced an event measurable from several independent systems. Equipment was rinsed over collection trays so residue could be sampled rather than lost. Each file received a duplicate before analysis. The investigation would later compare visible wakes with physical vessel positions, second by second. Kira and Owen recovered. Owen required treatment for blood loss and the leg wound. Kira was monitored for near-drowning exposure and exhaustion. Neither suffered permanent injury. Investigators reconstructed their route from the tracker, camera footage, equipment case, wreck marks, and surviving beacon packet. The skiff had accelerated toward a glowing outline, grounded on the reef, and capsized exactly as Owen described. Laboratory analysis confirmed a dense bloom of mechanically sensitive dinoflagellates. Agitating the samples produced the same blue-green light. Salinity, temperature, and nutrient conditions explained why the display had become unusually bright that night. Hydrodynamic models explained several phantom vessels. Current moving over wreck timbers, reef ledges, and seagrass produced organized turbulence. Dense plankton made those invisible patterns visible, sometimes reconstructing the approximate footprint of the obstruction below. Researchers tested scale models in a flow tank seeded with the same organisms. Wreck shapes produced luminous ribs and hull edges for several seconds. Adding fish extended the patterns into moving wakes, demonstrating how natural processes could imitate a departing vessel. No experiment reproduced a complete vessel turning against current. Models also failed to activate water inside closed compartments, as recorded on our patrol boat. Those observations remained outside the biological and hydrodynamic explanation. Fish schools preserved other wakes. They entered disturbed water behind a boat and extended its outline after the vessel turned away. Viewed from a low angle, separate lines of fish could resemble gunwales, cabins, or masts. 14 recorded shapes remained unexplained. They crossed deep water without sonar targets, traveled against measured current and wind, or continued after the plankton should have stopped glowing. Several matched vessels documented in the park's maritime records. One outline resembled a former patrol launch lost during a hurricane before I joined the park. Its hull had never been recovered. The recorded shape included damage along the same side described in the original incident report. Search procedures changed after the review. Bioluminescent wakes could indicate motion, but never prove that a vessel or swimmer was present. Teams required radar, sonar, navigation lights, radio contact, direct illumination, or physical water displacement before following an apparent target. Night crews also logged engine changes and vessel headings, so lingering wakes could be assigned to known movement. In dense blooms, search routes were designed from tide, wind, depth, and last verified position before visual targets were considered. The new protocol was tested with simulated missing boater searches. Crews that followed bright wakes repeatedly entered shallow hazards. Crews using confirmed positions and current models found the targets faster, even when they ignored the most convincing shapes. Monitoring cameras remained at the dock through the next bloom. Most nights showed fish, propeller wash, and scattered flashes against pilings. Nothing formed a complete hull until the final week of the survey. Shortly before dawn, a luminous patrol boat entered the empty harbor without disturbing the floating barrier. It crossed 2 occupied slips, turned toward the dock, and stopped where the lost launch had once been assigned. No hull touched the dock. On the recording, a wet bow line rose from the glowing water, wrapped itself around an empty cleat, and pulled tight. Bryce Canyon is not one canyon. It is a chain of amphitheaters cut into a high plateau, crowded with fins, windows, and hoodoos. From the rim, those formations look motionless and orderly. Below it, every turn can hide the trail, the sky, and the last landmark you trusted. I had worked there for 11 years before the October night, when 2 members of our trail crew disappeared below the rim. I knew that rock moved at Bryce. We closed paths for slides, cleared fresh debris, and watched cracks widen after wet days and freezing nights. Movement was part of the landscape, but it always left something behind. Most emergencies below the rim begin with ordinary mistakes. Visitors underestimate the elevation, carry too little water, or descend farther than they can climb. Staff members are trained against those failures. When trained employees vanish on a marked assignment, the possibilities become narrower and usually more serious. Luis Ortega and Ben Avery were sent to inspect erosion sensors near a closed connector below the Queen's Garden Trail. Both were experienced, equipped for cold weather, and authorized to enter the closure. Their assignment was simple: photograph the instruments, replace 2 batteries, and return before the afternoon temperature fell below freezing. Their work plan required scheduled radio checks at the junction and the sensor cluster. The first check arrived on time. The second included normal battery readings and a photograph of clear runoff entering a fracture. The third never came. Nothing in the earlier messages suggested injury, equipment failure, or concern. The sensors had been installed after a shallow section of trail began shedding clay and limestone. They measured soil moisture, rock temperature, vibration, and the width of several known fractures. The crew carried a survey receiver, a laser rangefinder, radios, first aid gear, and enough insulation for an unexpected night outside. Rain had passed over the amphitheater before dawn. Sunlight warmed the rim during the afternoon, and meltwater ran into joints throughout the formations. A cold front arrived faster than forecast. Shortly after sunset, the temperature dropped hard enough to turn runoff into clear ice along the shaded switchbacks. Luis sent the final data packet while they were still below the trail junction. Their receiver showed both men moving north toward the rim. 9 minutes later, the next position appeared south of their previous location, beyond a wall of hoodoos that had no mapped opening. The following point returned north again, but from inside the same rock wall. Dispatch tried both radios. One unit transmitted a carrier without speech, then went silent. The other produced 3 short bursts of scraping noise. Their emergency beacons had not activated, and neither man reached the trailhead by the agreed time. I descended with Ranger Naomi Bell, who supervised technical rescue, and Dr. Adrian Shaw, the park geologist assigned to the sensor project. A second team remained at the rim with hauling equipment, medical supplies, and a litter. We expected an injury, a rockfall, or a receiver distorted by steep terrain. Incident Command divided the search into fixed responsibilities. Naomi controlled movement and anchors. Adrian evaluated rock stability and interpreted the sensors. I handled navigation, medical response, and communication. The team at the rim logged every transmission so that a missing message would be treated as evidence rather than overlooked in the confusion. Our packs carried ropes, anchors, thermal blankets, oxygen, a compact geophone, and reflective route tabs. Adrian brought a handheld scanner that compared visible formations with a survey completed earlier that month. Naomi recorded every turn and tied our route only to living trees, embedded bolts, or exposed bedrock. We established one rule before leaving the maintained trail: a hoodoo, a loose boulder, or a pile of talus could guide us only after we verified it against a fixed survey point. At night, repeated shapes create false familiarity. Under active freeze conditions, a familiar shape can also be the first thing to fall. The descent was quiet except for ice breaking beneath our boots. Moonlight filled the spaces between the formations and left their red sides nearly black. Every few minutes, a pebble clicked somewhere below us. The sound traveled through the amphitheater and returned from several directions. At the closed junction, the trail sign was still upright. Its arrow pointed into a narrow corridor between two fins. I had installed that sign myself. The post had not turned, and its concrete footing was unbroken. The corridor it indicated had been on the other side of the post. Naomi checked the sign with a compass while Adrian found the brass survey disc beside its footing. Both remained in their recorded positions. The ground between them had not rotated or slumped. The fixed objects were correct, yet the opening they were meant to identify had moved almost 30 feet across the slope. We compared the junction with photographs taken during the battery installation. Individual capstones matched, including chips and dark mineral bands. Their order had changed. A narrow pillar once visible behind the sign now stood in front of it, while a forked hoodoo had crossed from the eastern side of the frame to the west. We swept the corridor with headlamps. It descended through orange limestone and disappeared behind a thin fin. The old opening was now blocked by a hoodoo wider than a vehicle. Its base rose directly from undisturbed clay, with no slide scar, trench, or rubble showing how it had arrived. Adrian reminded us that frost wedging can break rock with enormous pressure. Water enters a fracture, freezes, expands, and gradually separates the stone. Rockfalls can change a trail in seconds. What we saw could still be explained by collapse, darkness, and an outdated memory of the junction. The explanation mattered, because panic destroys search discipline. If we labeled every unfamiliar formation impossible, we would stop testing safer causes and begin reacting to shapes. Adrian kept naming measurable processes, while Naomi kept checking anchors. Neither pretended that the measurements already made sense. Then a crack sounded to our left. Another answered farther downslope. The sequence continued through the hoodoos, each report separated by the same short interval. It did not resemble loose stone falling at random. It sounded like a fracture traveling through the amphitheater one pillar at a time. Adrian placed the scanner on a tripod and measured 3 capstones used as references. The nearest matched the earlier survey. The second was several inches closer than it had been. The third shifted while the laser remained on it, shortening the measured distance without producing any visible motion. We clipped our first rope to a maintenance bolt set into the plateau wall. Naomi marked the line with reflective tabs and photographed every anchor. If the corridor changed behind us, the rope would preserve a physical connection to something deeper and more stable than the isolated formations. The RIM team tracked our progress on a printed topographic map and a digital incident board. We transmitted bearings, slope angles, and rope lengths instead of descriptions, such as left or behind the tall hoodoo. Those words depend on a landscape remaining recognizable, and ours had already failed that test. Several hundred feet below the junction, we found Ben's pack beneath an overhang. The shoulder straps were intact, and the waist belt was open. A broken sensor battery lay beside it. The pack contained food, insulation, and his emergency beacon, which meant he had abandoned the equipment quickly. His helmet camera was still recording. The last clear clip showed Luis walking along a normal trail between 2 familiar hoodoos. Ben looked down to step over ice. When the camera rose again, the trail ended at a wall. No collapse appeared on the recording. The wall occupied the frame between one step and the next. Boot prints led away from the pack, across pale dust. Both sets were easy to distinguish. Luis had a worn edge on his right heel, while Ben's boots carried a square tread. The tracks entered a slot barely wide enough for one person and continued through darkness. We followed until the rope tightened behind Naomi died out. The line no longer ran through the corridor we had used. It passed directly into the side of a hoodoo. The rope remained uncut and under tension, but several yards of it had disappeared inside solid rock. Turning back was no longer safer than continuing. Our fixed anchor remained behind us, yet the route to it had been sealed without severing the connection. Naomi attached a second rope to a bedrock ledge and ordered the rim team to treat our path as unstable. Before the message ended, Ben's radio transmitted from somewhere below. We heard breathing, fabric dragging over stone, and a repeated metallic tap. No words came through. Adrian placed the geophone on the ground, and the tapping appeared as a clean signal moving slowly beneath our feet. The signal stopped near a shallow alcove that had not existed on Adrian's earlier scan. Thermal imaging showed a warm shape behind fallen slabs. We called Ben's name and received 2 taps from inside. Naomi tested each block before we moved anything, because one careless lift could release the entire stack. Cold air flowed from the gap around Ben, proving that the cavity connected with another opening. We could not find that opening from outside. The airflow pulsed at the same interval as the fractures, briefly carrying limestone dust outward before reversing into the pile. We reached him through a gap near the floor. Ben was conscious, hypothermic, and pinned at the thigh by a slab. His helmet had cracked, but his pupils responded normally. The trapped leg had circulation, and no blood suggested an arterial injury. His radio had been crushed between his chest and the rock. After we stabilized him, Ben described what had happened without speaking above a whisper. He and Lewis had watched their mapped route close in front of them. When they turned around, their own footprints led into a different corridor. Ben stopped, but Lewis believed the opening would reconnect with the trail. Ben had preserved useful details despite pain and exposure. He remembered the direction of runoff, the color of the surrounding layers, and the number of vibration pulses before the slab fell. He also remembered that every new passage opened slightly lower than the last, drawing both men away from the rim. The ground shifted while they argued. A fin leaned across the space between them, not fast enough to strike either man, but fast enough to block sight. Ben tried to climb around it. The slab fell, trapped his leg, and forced him to abandon the pack before he could activate the beacon. Luis had continued downslope to search for another way out. He carried the survey receiver, a coil of accessory cord, and the second radio. Ben heard him tapping on stone for nearly an hour. The sound grew farther away, then began returning from beneath the alcove. Removing the slab took 20 minutes. Naomi built a small mechanical advantage system from 2 anchors and raised the rock just enough for me to free the leg. Ben had a severe fracture but remained stable. We splinted him, insulated him from the frozen ground, and gave oxygen at a controlled rate. Moving him immediately would expose him to falling rock and force the entire team through corridors we could no longer verify. We established a casualty shelter beneath a bedrock roof, not an isolated capstone. The rim team began descending with a litter, but stopped above the first altar junction. I sent Ben's vital signs and injury assessment to medical control. We warmed his torso before his limbs, protected the fractured leg from further movement, and monitored circulation below the splint. His condition was serious, but temporarily stable. That gave us time to locate Luis without turning one missing worker into 2 casualties. Adrian downloaded the nearest sensor data. Moisture inside the fractures had risen through the afternoon, then frozen from the rim downward. Each temperature drop was followed by a vibration pulse. The pulses repeated at regular intervals and traveled against the expected direction of drainage. He drove the geophone spike deeper into the clay. The next pulse appeared first as a low tremor, followed by hundreds of small fractures. Loose grains lifted from the ground. Several hoodoos shifted by less than the width of a finger, but the spaces between them changed far more than their individual movements suggested. The amphitheater behaved like a field of crowded doors. One door moved slightly and pressed the next. Lines of pressure traveled through fins, pillars, and broken slopes. Open corridors closed, while old fractures widened into new passages elsewhere. Naomi remained with Ben while Adrian and I followed the tapping signal. We traveled only during the quiet interval after each pulse. At every stop, we anchored to bedrock and scanned the next shelter. The route descended away from the rim, but Luis' radio signal was stronger. Near the bottom of a narrow chute, we found fresh fibers caught on a limestone edge. They matched the orange cord from Luis' pack. The fibers continued across the wall at shoulder height, then vanished into unbroken stone. From beyond that wall came 3 slow taps and the scrape of someone trying to stand. The next pressure pulse opened a seam beside the cord. Dust poured from it, revealing a passage too narrow for our packs. We removed the packs, pushed them ahead, and entered sideways. The seam widened into a circular basin surrounded by hoodoos that leaned inward like teeth. Louise lay beside the survey receiver in the center. One ankle was badly sprained, and blood had dried along his scalp. He was alert but confused from cold and altitude. His gloves were torn because he had spent hours striking the receiver pole against the rock. He had tried to navigate by the instrument until its map placed him outside the basin. Each time he approached the displayed route, a formation blocked it. The receiver coordinates remained plausible, but the physical relationship between those coordinates had changed. Eventually, he stopped walking and used the pole to signal. The basin had no visible exit except the seam behind us. Broken route tabs covered the floor. Some were ours, although we had placed them hundreds of feet upslope. Their holes still held fragments of bark, bolt metal, and limestone from the surfaces where Naomi had attached them. That detail eliminated wind as an explanation. The tabs had not blown loose. Pieces of their anchors had traveled with them, as if small sections of several distant surfaces had been cut away and deposited together. Adrian sealed samples in evidence bags before the next pulse buried the floor in dust. I connected Luis to a waist harness while Adrian anchored us to a band of exposed doloston. The stone was harder than the surrounding layers and appeared continuous beneath the basin. We treated it as a temporary island inside a field of weaker material. Another pulse arrived early. The seam closed until only our rope passed through it. The hoodoos around the basin tilted by small, separate amounts. Their capstones stayed balanced, but the spaces between their bases narrowed. Dust rose without wind and covered our footprints. The survey receiver recorded the pulse as a moving pressure front rather than a single impact. Its direction curved around the basin, paused at our dolostone anchor, and divided on either side. The harder layer did not stop the movement. It forced the movement to choose weaker material around us. Adrian's measurements suggested that liquid water remained trapped below the frozen surface. Expanding ice squeezed that water through connected joints. The resulting pressure fractured weak layers and lubricated clay slopes at the same time. Natural processes could explain motion, but not its speed, coordination, or repeated preference for occupied corridors. The sensor network gave us one advantage. The pulses moved through the same stations in a consistent sequence. If the pattern held, the seam behind us would reopen after the pressure reached a deeper drainage. We had less than a minute to cross before the next contraction began. We secured Luis between us and waited with our headlamps off. Darkness removed the distracting shapes and made the vibrations easier to feel through our boots. When the rope slackened, Adrian entered first. I pushed Luis through after him and followed as the seam widened. The rock closed against my pack before I cleared it. I released one shoulder strap and left the pack inside the basin. The seam crushed the metal frame without touching my back. Medical gear, water, and the camera were lost, but the rope and leash remained with us. We reached Ben's shelter during the next quiet interval. Naomi had prepared the litter and recorded the movement cycles. The descending rescue team was still separated from us by 2 sealed corridors. Their ropes reached our area, but every line now passed through rock or around bends too sharp for hauling. Adrian compared the new scans with the earlier survey and identified a chain of resistant doloston caps leading toward the maintained switchbacks. The ordinary trail crossed weak clay between them. A direct rescue route would be steeper, but it would keep us near the most stable material in the amphitheater. We transferred Ben to the litter, attached Louise to a separate guideline, and divided the remaining equipment. Nobody carried anything that could not be abandoned. Our escape plan depended on fixed stone, timed movement, and the rope team above us. It did not depend on finding the trail again. Naomi led the litter while Adrian watched the geophone. Louis moved behind me with his injured ankle secured. Each time a pulse passed, we sheltered beneath a doloston band and waited for the finer rock to settle. The spaces ahead changed, but the hard layer remained visible through dust. The first 2 crossings were slow and controlled. At the third, reflective tabs appeared on both sides of us. One set belonged to our inward route, while the other had been torn from anchors near Ben's shelter. The markers no longer showed direction. We stripped them down and trusted only rope tension and recorded coordinates. Ben's temperature began to fall during the delay. I added chemical heat packs around his torso and rechecked the splint after every crossing. Louis carried spare insulation despite his ankle. Progress became slower, but rushing a litter through unstable stone would have exchanged a controlled medical problem for an unrecoverable fall. A narrow fin collapsed across the route before the litter cleared it. Naomi pulled Ben beneath a capstone while I dragged Louis behind a bedrock rib. The collapse produced less rubble than its size should have created. Much of the fin seemed to descend intact into soft clay. The geophone briefly lost the repeating pattern. Vibrations arrived from every direction, overlapping until Adrian could no longer identify a safe interval. We remained clipped to the dolostone and covered Ben from falling fragments. After several minutes, the scattered signals joined into a single pulse moving toward the gully. That failure exposed the continuous dolostone layer Adrian had identified. It rose diagonally toward the rim like the edge of a buried staircase. We clipped our guideline along it and climbed beside the vanished trail. The geophone pulses strengthened as the frozen ground contracted. We reached a gully separating us from the lowest maintained switchback. It was too wide to step across and too unstable for the litter. The rescue team above lowered a second rope from a mature pine rooted behind the rim wall. Naomi built a tensioned highline between that anchor and our dolostone ledge. Every command across the gully was repeated and confirmed by radio. Dust hid the teams from one another, and hand signals were useless. The rim haul crew worked from Naomi's counts, while Adrian watched the ground. If either rhythm changed, the litter stopped until both systems were synchronized again. Louis crossed first in a rescue harness. Ben followed inside the litter with a tagline controlling rotation. Halfway over the gully, another pulse moved through the formations. The far anchor held, but our ledge dropped several inches, and the high line sagged toward falling debris. Adrian and I braced the system while Naomi hauled from the far side. A hoodoo leaned across the line and scraped the litter frame. Its capstone passed above Ben's chest by inches. The formation continued moving until the rope cut a fresh groove through its surface. When Ben reached the switchback, our ledge split. Adrian jumped for the high line and clipped across. I remained long enough to release the lower anchor, preventing the failing block from pulling everyone into the gully. The ledge rolled beneath me as I transferred my weight to the rope. The rescue team hauled me to the switchback. From there, the maintained trail climbed through a steep corridor toward the rim. Sections had filled with debris, so we used hand lines and short litter raises. We never moved beneath an unsupported wall during a pressure pulse. We reached the rim shortly before dawn. Ben went to an ambulance while Louis was treated in the incident room before transport. No aircraft had entered the amphitheater. Every person came out by anchors, rope systems, measured intervals, and the decision to stop searching for a trail that no longer existed. As the sky brightened, I looked back from Sunset Point. The hoodoos appeared unchanged from every photograph sold in the visitor center. Then the closed junction sign rose slowly from a corridor far below. It remained upright in its concrete footing and pointed directly at us. Ben required surgery, but kept his leg. Louis recovered from hypothermia, a concussion, and ligament damage. Adrian had several fractured fingers from holding the high line. Naomi and I carried bruises and minor cuts. The park closed the affected trails before the first public visitors reached the rim. All four of us gave separate statements before comparing memories. Investigators collected our cameras, radios, damaged ropes, clothing, and navigation logs. That separation prevented us from unconsciously building one shared version of the night. The major details still matched, including the moving sign, the sealed rope, and the timed pressure pulses. The investigation lasted through winter. Survey crews installed fixed prisms along the plateau wall and scanned the amphitheater from multiple viewpoints. Engineers mapped every rockfall, crack, and slump. We recovered both abandoned packs, the crushed frame, the damaged radios, and several sensors after the ground stabilized. Independent geologists repeated the scans using different instruments and control points. Aerial photographs were aligned with stable sections of the plateau rather than with the hoodoos themselves. Equipment error could explain a bad distance or position, but it could not explain identical changes recorded from opposite sides of the amphitheater. Much of the event had ordinary explanations. Bryce experiences repeated freezing and thawing, and frost wedging is a major force in shaping its formations. Wet clay can fail, limestone can fracture, and a series of small movements can produce a large collapse. Darkness and narrow sightlines also distort distance. Investigators reconstructed several closures with conventional slope models. Those models produced debris fans, broken capstones, and downhill displacement. Our photographs showed upright formations, missing debris, and movement across the slope. Increasing the modeled pressure only destroyed the formations instead of reproducing what had occurred. Those facts explained the danger, but they did not explain the geometry. The volume of recovered debris was far smaller than the volume of rock that had blocked our routes. Several hoodoos changed position without leaving trenches or damaged bases. Survey discs remained fixed while entire corridors appeared on opposite sides of them. The laser scans created the clearest record. Between consecutive passes, separate formations shifted only inches. However, every opening used by a person closed during the next pressure pulse. New openings appeared along the direction that person had been moving, drawing us deeper before turning back toward the rim. Sensor data showed something worse. The first coordinated pulse began before the temperature fell below freezing. It started at the station Louis and Ben were servicing, divided into two branches, and followed their separate routes after they became trapped. Later, pulses divided again when our team entered the closure. An outside review concluded that the instruments had probably misread complex vibration traveling through fractured stone. That was the safest statement the evidence allowed. It did not address why each branch matched the cadence, pauses, and direction changes of a specific person walking above it. We changed our rescue procedures. After wet weather and a rapid freeze, no team enters the hoodoos without geophones, fixed anchors, continuous route recording, and an observer at the rim. Reflective tabs are considered secondary evidence. A mapped trail is never assumed to remain open simply because its coordinates have not changed. Years have passed, and most visitors never hear about that night. They see beautiful formations shaped by water, ice, and time. That description is true. What we omit is that time does not always move at the same speed below the rim. Last winter, a monitoring station activated during a closed night. The air was dry, the ground held no meltwater, and the temperature had remained below freezing for days. Pressure signals began at the old junction and traveled upward through the amphitheater in 4 separate lines. 2 lines stopped where Luis and Ben had been found. The other 2 followed Naomis and my escape route to the rim. When the final pulse reached the locked incident room, the concrete floor lifted once beneath the map table, as if something below had arrived and was waiting to be shown the way out. Most people imagine Death Valley as a place where nothing moves except heat. They picture empty roads, pale mountains, and salt lying dead beneath a white sky. That image is useful for postcards. It is dangerous for anyone who mistakes dryness for stability. The valley floor changes whenever water reaches it. Floods descend from distant slopes, carrying mud and dissolved minerals into a basin with no outlet. Temporary lakes spread across the lowest ground, then disappear into the air. Salt remains behind in layers, sealing wet sediment beneath a surface that can look stronger than it is. I had worked in the park for 9 years when an early winter storm crossed the Panamint Range and flooded several closed roads. Badwater Road remained restricted while crews inspected washouts. The popular boardwalk was intact, but broad sections of the salt flat beyond it had been covered by shallow water. Storm damage had complicated every response in the southern park. Culverts were blocked, radio repeaters had intermittent power, and several dirt approaches ended at fresh channels. A search that appeared close on a map could require hours of driving around damaged roads before anyone reached the correct side of the basin. 2 hydrology technicians entered an authorized research transect 3 days after the storm. Maya Ellison specialized in brine chemistry. Curtis Vale maintained pressure loggers used to study water beneath the crust. They parked on designated pavement and continued on foot with a narrow equipment sled built to distribute weight. Their task was to replace flooded data modules and measure the new brine level. The route followed fixed survey stakes across an area closed to visitors. Both technicians carried satellite messengers, radios, flotation pads, probes, water, cold weather layers, and a written turnaround time. The work had environmental limits as well as safety limits. They were required to walk inside an established research corridor because footprints can remain on fragile salt for years. Every sample site was approached along the same line, reducing both surface damage and uncertainty in later measurements. The first report showed saturated mud beneath a thin salt cap. The second included unusually high pressure at a shallow monitoring well. Maya requested an additional hour to retrieve a logger before the cooling surface hardened around it. The request was approved with a revised check-in schedule. Pressure at the well had climbed before, usually after runoff reached the basin. Those increases developed slowly and declined as water spread through mud. The new reading rose in sharp steps. Each step appeared immediately after one technician crossed the instrument cable, making faulty wiring seem more likely than dangerous ground. No further message arrived. Their satellite track continued for another 40 minutes, tracing a tight rectangle around the same cluster of survey stakes. Each circuit followed the previous one almost perfectly. The final positions overlapped so closely that the map displayed a single dark line. Dispatch called both radios and received only a wet clicking sound. The satellite messengers accepted incoming texts, but returned no confirmation. Their vehicle remained locked at the road, and the paper permit under its windshield showed the correct route and emergency contacts. The incident began as an overdue employee search, not a wilderness mystery. Command checked hospitals, alternate work sites, vehicle mileage, and every message timestamp. The technicians had not changed assignments or left the park. Their equipment, route, and last known position all placed them beyond the road on newly flooded salt. I joined Ranger Mateo Ruiz and Park Hydrologist Dr. Imani Cole at the closure. Mateo directed technical rescue and had worked mud and ice incidents in several parks. Imani understood the basin's groundwater better than anyone on our shift. I handled navigation, medical response, and incident communication. We brought ground-coupled radar, thermal imaging, long probes, gas monitors, rescue boards, inflatable flotation panels, rope, and a lightweight litter. A second team remained on firm alluvial gravel with a vehicle-mounted winch. Every rescuer wore a harness connected to a line that could be cut if the crust began pulling us under. No aircraft launched. Low cloud covered the mountain passes, and gusts pushed dust across the basin. Even with clear air, rotor wash over a fragile salt surface could destroy the only footprints available to us. We planned a ground rescue using load distribution and fixed bearings from the surrounding rock. Before stepping onto the flat, Imani established our rule. White ground was not firm ground. We would trust probe resistance, radar depth, and measured pressure. We would not trust color, dryness, or an existing track, because all three could hide mud beneath a brittle shell. The same standard applied to footprints. A clear tread could confirm that somebody had passed, but it could not prove that the surface still supported weight. Our first mile followed the technicians' outward prints. Their boots had crushed dark mud through the salt in several places, leaving clear tread. Wind had softened the edges, but had not erased them. The equipment sled made 2 parallel grooves between the tracks. At the first survey stake, another set of footprints joined the route. They matched Maya's boots exactly, including a triangular repair on the left heel. The copied prints were deeper, wetter, and positioned beneath salt that had not been broken from above. Mateo photographed the prints with a scale, while Imani cut a narrow inspection window beside one heel. The surface layer remained continuous across the depression. Salt crystals curved downward into the shape as if pressure had pushed from underneath instead of weight pressing from above. The copied trail ran parallel to Maya's for 20 yards, then crossed between her steps. In several places, the extra heel marks occupied spaces too small for a person to stand without striking her legs. No second boot size appeared. Whatever produced the trail had repeated only Maya's left foot. Radar showed a shallow brine lens beneath us. Its roof rose under each copied print and dipped under the original track. Imani believed pressure from the technician's passage had traveled through wet sediment and deformed weaker sections of crust. That could explain displaced impressions, but not the repaired tread pattern. She calibrated the radar over a known test plate carried by our team. Its depth and shape appeared correctly, ruling out a simple display error. A probe driven beside the print entered hard salt, then empty space, then mud. The cavity under the heel had the dimensions of the mark above it. We advanced on flotation panels placed one ahead of another. Our boots never touched untested salt. Mateo probed every step, while Imani watched the radar and I maintained the bearing to a black outcrop on the western fan. The repeated system was slow, but speed was less important than leaving a route that could support a litter. Salt crystals snapped beneath the panels with sounds like distant glass. Some cracks ended at polygon edges. Others continued across several cells before fading beyond our lights. Each time the noise stopped, the silence felt deeper because the flat held no vegetation, insects, or running water to disguise movement below us. A dull impact passed through the ground. It was not a sound carried by air. The vibration entered through my knees and tightened the safety line against my harness. Several yards behind us, the salt surface dropped in a straight row, forming 3 fresh impressions the size of Mateo's boots. We stopped moving. Another impression appeared, then another. Each depression formed after the same delay as our recent steps. The sequence did not begin at our current position. It began where Mateo had first left the gravel and advanced along his route toward us. Incident Command marked the timing. The delay between Mateo's footfall and each copied impression remained nearly constant, even as the distance increased. That behavior suggested a traveling pressure wave rather than simple collapse. The wave preserved sequence, spacing, and differences in the force of each step. Command compared the marks with video from my chest camera. Mateo had shifted extra weight onto one foot while moving a panel. Minutes later, the corresponding copied print sank deeper on the same side. The surface reproduced not merely his route, but how his body had balanced during each movement. The technician's track reached a low equipment sled lying on its side. One handle had punched through the crust. Sample bottles, cables, and flotation pads were scattered nearby. None had blown far, because a ridge of fresh salt had grown around them after the floodwater receded. No drag marks connected the scattered objects. Each item rested inside its own shallow depression, suggesting that the surface had lifted and lowered them separately. Maya's pack remained strapped to the sled. Curtis's pack was missing. Their radios lay together inside a waterproof case, explaining the clicking signal, but not why both had abandoned communication. One satellite messenger had a shattered screen. The other displayed an unsent emergency report filled with repeated pressure warnings. Their field notebook recorded rising brine after every circuit around the logger. The pressure increased when they walked and relaxed when they stopped. Maya had drawn a second trail beside their route, noting that it appeared from below. The last entry stated that the duplicate prints had begun turning inward. The rectangular satellite track now made sense. They had not become disoriented. They were testing the relationship between movement and pressure by walking a controlled loop. Each circuit narrowed because the copied trail formed closer to them, forcing both technicians away from ground that appeared to be breaking upward. We found the logger cable stretched across the salt and descending through a hole no wider than a finger. Mateo pulled gently. The cable moved several inches, then tightened from a direction opposite the monitoring well. Something below had dragged the instrument laterally through the mud. Imani connected a reader to the exposed cable. The logger showed rapid pressure changes moving in a closed loop around the technicians. Each loop became smaller. The final pulse crossed directly beneath their last satellite positions, then divided into two separate branches. One branch followed Curtis's boot prints toward the southwest. The other continued beneath a trail of Maya's copied left heels. Her original footprints ended beside the overturned sled. The duplicates continued across unbroken white salt toward the center of the basin. Thermal imaging showed no body on the surface. Radar found several shallow cavities, all too small to shelter a person. Then our gas monitor detected elevated carbon dioxide rising through a crack beside the copied trail. Warm, damp air escaped in brief pulses timed with the impressions. We traced the airflow across the salt without following the false heels. The crack curved east while the duplicated trail continued south. That difference mattered. A trapped person needed an air path. A pressure wave needed only weak crust, and it appeared to be drawing us away from the ventilation source. Radar identified a broad void beneath a hard salt plate. The space was less than 3 feet high and surrounded by saturated mud. At its center, a warm shape moved against the lower surface. We called Maya's name and received a series of impacts from below. Mateo anchored our rescue boards beyond the void and spread 3 flotation panels over its edge. I cut a small opening with a hand saw while he vacuumed loose crystals away. Power tools were avoided because vibration could collapse the plate or ignite unknown gases concentrated inside the cavity. The first opening released warm brine vapor and the smell of wet minerals. Maya's face appeared beneath us, coated in gray mud and salt. She had one shoulder wedged above the brine and both legs trapped under the overturned lower edge of the equipment sled. Air inside the cavity was breathable, but deteriorating. Carbon dioxide accumulated near the brine, and every pressure pulse reduced the space above Maya's mouth. The gas monitor gave us a limited working interval. If the roof lowered much farther, she would lose the air pocket before the crust fully collapsed. We enlarged the opening along a natural crack rather than cutting a new circle. Mateo lowered a harness while Imani monitored the roof with radar. Maya remained conscious but weak. Her skin was cold, her breathing rapid, and the hand gripping the harness had lost normal color. She followed instructions without wasting movement. That discipline mattered because struggling would load the remaining plate from below. We secured her chest first, then supported her head against the sled frame. Every adjustment was passed through Mateo so that the surface team never pulled against my underwater work. The sled had broken through when the salt beneath it rose and tilted. Maya fell into the cavity, but the frame caught across the opening and created a narrow air pocket. Curtis had remained on the surface long enough to push flotation pads under her shoulders. He then left to retrieve rope from his pack. Maya felt his steps through the crust above her. A second set followed each movement from underneath. When Curtis stopped, the lower impacts continued. The last series moved away toward the southwest, matching the branch recorded by the logger. We could not lift Maya until we freed her legs from the submerged frame. I entered the opening on a tether with my weight supported by the boards. Vine reached my chest and forced cold through my dry layers. Beneath the surface, a sled felt twisted around her boot. Mateo tensioned the frame while I cut the damaged strap. Dight. The plate flexed with each movement. New heel-shaped depressions formed around the boards, reproducing the positions of our knees and elbows rather than our boots. The crust was no longer copying footwear alone. It was copying every concentrated load. The brine beneath me pulsed against the cavity wall. On each surge, the muddy floor rose around my legs and tightened like wet concrete. I kept one hand on Maya and one on the tether. Losing either would allow the water to turn an extraction into two entrapments. We extracted Maya onto the litter and slid her away from the void. She had a fractured ankle, deep abrasions, and early hypothermia. Brine had soaked her lower clothing and irritated the wounds. We removed wet layers, irrigated her eyes, insulated her, and began warmed oxygen. Her core temperature continued falling after removal because cold blood returned from her limbs. We handled her horizontally, avoided unnecessary massage, and insulated the litter beneath as carefully as above. A patient on cold salt can lose heat into the ground faster than blankets alone can replace it. Medical control agreed that she needed immediate evacuation. She was stable enough for a slow ground movement, but not for another prolonged search delay. Curtis had been missing longer, and the southwest trail crossed an area where radar showed larger voids. I faced the decision every rescue leader eventually dreads. Continue toward a second victim and risk the living patient, or withdraw without knowing whether someone nearby could still be saved. We divided the team rather than pretending both goals carried equal urgency. Command approved a firm turnaround time and recorded it. Setting that limit before seeing the second site prevented grief from quietly rewriting the rescue plan. Mateo remained with Maya and prepared the litter route. Imani and I followed Curtis's original prints for a limited search period, tethered to the same firm anchor line. If radar showed continuous mud or Maya deteriorated, we would turn back regardless of what lay ahead. The copied impressions changed as we moved. They stopped repeating our recent steps and began reproducing the deeper marks Curtis had made hours earlier. A second trail was replaying his last route beneath our feet, one pressure pulse at a time. Curtis had used flotation pads for the first part of his path. Their broad rectangular marks remained visible, followed by a stagger where he began carrying them instead. His right boot then dragged through every third step, suggesting an injury or a surface that pulled at his foot. We found his pack upright on a salt polygon with the rescue rope still inside. The zipper was open, but nothing had been removed. A glove lay several yards ahead. Its palm was pressed into the crust from below, visible through a translucent layer like an object trapped beneath ice. The pack straps carried fresh salt on their undersides, but none on topside. It appeared to have sunk partially, then been returned upright by pressure beneath the crust. Curtis's probe was clipped to one side. Its lower section had bent into a smooth curve rather than breaking at a joint. Imani scanned around the glove. Radar returned a long channel filled with dense brine and several solid shapes. The channel had no surface opening within our tether range. It curved under the copied trail and continued toward the center of the flat. A cold, human-sized return appeared beside the glove, deep enough to place it beneath the salt plate. We repeated the scan from 2 angles and marked the coordinates. The shape did not move. Its proportions, clothing layers, and attached metal buckle matched Curtis. We transmitted the evidence without naming a death over the open channel. Incident Command sent the coordinates to medical control and recorded our thermal readings. A second radar pass showed the same outline farther along the channel, but the glove and buckle remained fixed. The body-shaped return seemed stretched between 2 positions. There was no safe access from our position. The crust between us and the return was thin, and the brine channel had no reliable roof. Cutting down would have placed both rescuers above unsupported mud. Thermal readings showed no remaining body heat. We documented the location and ended the search. That decision was not surrender. It was recognition that recovery conditions are different from rescue conditions. Curtis could not be helped, while Maya could still die if we consumed her remaining warmth on an unstable salt flat. I placed a weighted marker on our final safe panel and photographed its bearing to the western outcrop. Why? We did not mark the crust above Curtis because any concentrated load could open the channel. His recovery would require engineering controls, daylight, and a route independent of our failing tether. As we turned back, the copied trail reached Curtis's final position. A heel depression formed above the body, followed by a toe. The next sprint appeared closer to us. Whatever pressure had recorded his route was now replaying it in reverse. Imani compared the logger data with our movement. The brine pulse traveled faster beneath unbroken crust and slowed under our flotation panels. Concentrated weight created a low-pressure wake in the mud, and surrounding fluid rushed toward it. Each recovery pulse struck the crust from below. That mechanism could make a surface depression follow a walker. It could even preserve general spacing for several minutes. It could not preserve a repaired heel, distinguish Curtis's limp hours later, or reverse the route after reaching his body. We returned to Maya as the first reverse print reached the abandoned pack. Mateo had built a continuous platform from the rescue boards and tied the litter to a low-friction sled. The winch team on gravel held our main line, but more than a mile of fragile surface remained between us. The direct route to the road crossed the shallowest brine. It was also the route our search team had used, meaning pressure waves were already traveling beneath it. A longer route angled toward an alluvial tongue where coarse sediment strengthened the crust. Although the detour increased distance, its buried gravel offered real structure. Shorter travel across unsupported salt would only create the appearance of a safer evacuation. The winch line could not simply drag us home. Continuous tension would cut through polygon edges and pull the litter sideways if a panel tilted. The shore team instead maintained light control, taking slack only after each move. Our panel still carried the full load across every unstable section. We chose the longer route. Imani mapped a chain of salt polygons with thicker edges, while Mateo calculated the litter load. We would move the patient across paired panels, retrieve the rear panel, and place it forward without allowing anyone to stand on bare crust. Every unnecessary item stayed behind. We kept water, medical gear, navigation, radar, ropes, insulation, and one evidence case. Cameras, sample bottles, spare clothing, and the damaged logger were sealed on a flotation pad and anchored for later recovery. When the litter began moving, the surface behind us answered. 4 depressions formed around Maya's old cavity. They arranged themselves where our hands and knees had pressed during the extraction, then advanced toward the route we had chosen. The first section held. Mateo and I alternated the panels while Imani probed ahead. Maya remained secured inside a vapor barrier and insulated wrap. Her pulse improved with warmth, but pain and exhaustion made her less responsive. Every delay narrowed the margin we had gained. I checked her breathing after each transfer and documented the time on my glove with a grease pencil. Her answers became shorter, then stopped. She still followed hand pressure, suggesting exhaustion rather than immediate loss of consciousness, but we treated every change as deterioration. The copied pressure front stayed behind us for several minutes. Its impressions were incomplete because the wide panels spread our weight. Instead of clear boots, long, shallow troughs appeared in the salt. They matched the length and timing of each panel placement. Dust lowered visibility until the mountains disappeared. Without those landmarks, the flat offered no sense of direction or scale. We followed the fixed winch bearing, verified by compass and satellite position. The rope itself remained slack enough to avoid cutting through the crust. Radio signals weakened close to the ground, forcing the shore team to relay through a portable repeater. We used brief reports containing distance, patient status, and panel count. Long explanations could wait. A missed number in the dust could place the winch load on the wrong movement. Halfway to the alluvial tongue, radar showed the brine channel turning beneath our route. It had followed the same arc as the copied depressions. The roof ahead was thinner than the surface behind, leaving us with no safe forward placement. Imani proposed redirecting the pressure, rather than outrunning it. We carried several water containers and the evidence pad, each heavy enough to create a controlled load. If placed away from our route, they might draw the recovery flow toward a new depression. We anchored the containers to a long cord and pushed the pad west across untested salt. Mateo released the load while I watched the radar. The crust sagged beneath it. A dark pressure line turned away from our route and moved toward the artificial weight. For several minutes, the copied troughs followed the decoy. That interval allowed us to reach the coarse edge of the alluvial deposit. Salt mixed with gravel beneath the panels, increasing resistance. We shortened the spacing and moved the litter faster. The maneuver consumed equipment we would normally protect. Water, cameras, and the evidence pad disappeared with the decoy route. Saving them would have cost time and returned weight to our platform. Once an object became more valuable than the patient, the rescue plan had already failed. The decoy pad suddenly vanished. Brine erupted through its position and dragged the cord tight across our path. Mateo cut it before the line could sweep under the litter. The pressure front divided, one branch remaining with the lost weight, while another resumed following us. Imani stepped onto a panel as the crust lifted beneath its far edge. The board tilted, dropping her leg into gray brine. Her harness caught before she submerged. I moved onto the opposite end to counterbalance while Mateo pulled her free without leaving Maya. We marked the failure point by bearing rather than placing an object near it. Added weight could widen the opening and sever the narrow gravel road ahead. The wet leg added weight and cold to our team. We removed Imani's outer layer, wrapped the limb, and redistributed equipment. She could still walk, but the radar had been submerged. Its screen returned intermittent bands instead of reliable depth. We continued with probes and the texture of the ground. Coarse gravel produced a sharper resistance than hollow salt. Mateo advanced the empty panel, tested its edges, and pulled the litter across. I remained clipped behind Maya, watching each old placement for collapse. The gravel tongue narrowed twice and vanished beneath newer salt. At each gap, we drove a probe diagonally until it struck buried stone, then aligned a panel above that contact. We were no longer following the visible surface. We were crossing an unseen chain of sediment carried from the mountains. The last broad salt section failed before we cleared it. A crack opened beneath the rear panel and ran toward the litter. I released my equipment bag onto the opposite side. The added load drew the fracture away long enough for Mateo to pull Maya onto gravel. I crossed last on a single board tied to the winch line. The crust dropped behind me in wide sheets, exposing black water and pale crystals underneath. The winch crew hauled the board until my boots reached the alluvial fan. Maya entered the ambulance shortly before sunrise. When I looked back, the flat appeared empty and unbroken, except for our route. Then a row of wet depressions reached the final salt polygon. They stopped where the crust met dry gravel, as if the pressure beneath them could go no farther. Maya spent several days in the hospital and later recovered full use of her ankle. Imani developed a chemical burn where brine entered her clothing but returned to duty. Mateo required stitches in one hand. I carried numbness in 2 fingers through the rest of winter. Curtis was recovered after the brine level fell and engineers built a supported access path. His body had moved more than 100 yards from the coordinates recorded during our search. The glove remained in its original location beneath the translucent crust. The official investigation identified a rare combination of recent flooding, newly formed salt, trapped brine, and soft mud-dyed end. The upper crust was thin enough to deform and strong enough to transmit pressure. Our movement created waves that traveled through connected subsurface channels. Samples from the copied prints contained the same minerals as surrounding crust. No foreign material, biological film, or chemical reaction marked their edges. Crystal growth showed that each depression had formed from below after the upper layer hardened, confirming what our field cuts had suggested. That explanation accounted for the sagging panels, the shifting logger, and several delayed depressions. It also explained why the technicians became trapped after circling the same site. Repeated loading had weakened a closed area until the crust and equipment sled failed together. It did not explain the tread details. Investigators cast several copied prints before the surface dried. Maya's triangular heel repair appeared in every cast, including tiny cuts made by wire inside the patch. Curtis's trail preserved the uneven pressure of an old knee injury, never listed in his medical file. The casts were compared with the actual boots under controlled light. Scratches appeared reversed, as expected from pressure rising into the crust, but their spacing was exact. A stone lodged in Mateo's tread during the rescue also appeared in later depressions, although the stone itself remained in his boot. Pressure records created another problem. Each wave began beneath a human footfall and followed the route at walking speed. After reaching the person who produced it, the wave should have dispersed. Instead, it remained coherent, reversed direction, and followed the newest moving weight. Engineers tested the flat with machines that repeated human loads. The crust produced ordinary circular waves and random cracks. It never copied a tread, changed direction, or waited between steps. Those behaviors occurred only when a person crossed the instrumented zone. They varied weight, pace, temperature, salinity, and panel size. Nothing reproduced the closed rectangular loops or the reverse trail from Curtis. The final technical report described an unresolved interaction between localized load and subsurface pressure. That wording concealed uncertainty without inventing an answer. The park changed field procedures after wet periods. Researchers now work from supported platforms and remain connected to fixed anchors. Pressure loggers are read remotely whenever possible. Any depression forming beneath intact crust is treated as an active subsurface hazard, regardless of its shape. Field teams also carry independent route records on paper. Electronic positions remain valuable, but coordinates cannot reveal whether the ground between 2 points is still continuous. The affected transect remained closed. Wind erased most surface evidence, and summer heat dried the upper mud. Visitors at Badwater continued walking onto the public salt flat, taking photographs of white polygons beneath the mountains. They never approached the research zone. For new rangers, the case became a practical lesson, rather than a ghost story. We showed them how to distribute weight, identify wet crust, and protect an anchor from lateral pull. We did not show the last camera sequence until they understood the ordinary hazards well enough to respect them. I tried to believe the event had ended with the water. The basin had flooded, pressure traveled through mud, and unstable salt failed under load. Those facts were enough for reports, training, and sleep on most nights. The following winter was dry. One monitoring station activated after midnight without rain, wind, or anyone on the closed flat. Its pressure trace began at the point where Curtis had been recovered and moved toward the road in the exact rhythm of his injured walk. A remote camera showed empty salt beneath clear stars. One depression formed, then another, each pressing upward from below. They reached the edge of the crust and stopped for nearly an hour. No mark appeared on the gravel. At dawn, I drove to inspect the station and found the gate locked. The gravel around my vehicle was dry and undisturbed. A single wet footprint marked the metal running board beneath the driver's door, bearing Curtis's tread and facing inward. The print was still filling with brine. Kralawea never allows a ranger to believe the ground is finished. A trail can cross rainforest, hardened lava, sulfur-stained cracks, and ash deposited before anyone alive was born. Beneath all of it, heat and gas continue moving through fractures that rarely match the surface. I had served at Hawaiʻi Volcanoes for 12 years, when fine volcanic glass began collecting in places the wind could not reach. At first, nobody considered that unusual. The summit had recently produced another episode of lava fountaining, and golden fibers had fallen across closed sections of the park. Those fibers are known as Pele's hair. They form when molten lava is stretched into threads and cooled into fragile glass. Individual strands can be almost invisible, but wind gathers them into mats and tangled rolls. They cut exposed skin, injure eyes, and become dangerous when inhaled. A sudden wind shift carried heavy fallout toward a remote monitoring corridor southwest of the summit. The area was already closed because of volcanic gases and unstable ground. Instruments there measured sulfur dioxide, temperature, deformation, and airflow through a network of shallow lava tubes. Kalai Nunes and Owen Price entered the corridor after air readings improved. Both worked with the park's volcanic hazards team. Kalai maintained gas stations, while Owen inspected tube vents and repaired field telemetry. They had full protective equipment and years of experience around fresh volcanic deposits. Their assignment required no entry into an underground passage. They would replace filters on 2 surface stations, inspect a damaged antenna, and return before afternoon convection strengthened. A signed route plan kept them outside the most fractured terrain and away from the active vent. Kalai's first report described normal gas levels, but unusually dense glass along the eastern embankment. Her next photograph showed strands stretched across the antenna box despite calm air. She noted static interference in the station housing and requested an anti-static kit from the vehicle. Their location record then separated. Owen's tracker moved toward a small, unnamed tube entrance used for airflow studies. Kalai's unit remained beside the station before following him several minutes later. Both signals stopped beneath the same section of older lava dat. No emergency beacon activated. Dispatch heard repeated clicks from Owen's radio, followed by the sound of fabric brushing a microphone. Kalai's radio transmitted open carrier for several seconds. Airflow and breathing were audible, but no words could be distinguished. I entered the closure with Ranger Hana Okafor and volcanologist Dr. Caleb Iwata Delta. Hana led technical rescue and medical operations. Caleb carried the station history and tube survey. I controlled navigation, atmospheric monitoring, and communication with Incident Command outside the fallout zone. We wore full eye protection, gloves, disposable outer layers, and powered respirators rated for particles. Gas instruments remained separate because particle filters do not protect against every volcanic gas. Our packs carried ropes, thermal imaging, grounding straps, copper mesh, water mist units, medical oxygen, and spare breathing hoods. A second team established decontamination near the road and prepared a litter. They could not follow until we defined a safe route. Every rescuer entering the corridor would increase airborne glass, consume clean filters, and add static charge through movement across dry lava. We assigned fixed duties before crossing the closure. Hana watched people and anchors. Caleb watched the volcanic environment. I watched instruments and route. Nobody would pursue a visual target unless at least 2 measurements supported it. Golden fibers could make empty space appear solid and solid rock appear covered by movement. Incident Command logged our filter pressure and cylinder levels at every check. Respiratory failure often develops gradually, and a rescuer can adapt to increasing effort without recognizing the loss. Recorded numbers would expose a dangerous trend before judgment became impaired. The first section looked ordinary. Threads lay against cracks and low shrubs, aligned with the morning wind. Our boots disturbed small clouds that glittered in headlamp beams. We moved slowly enough to keep the material near the ground and avoided touching any visible mat. We also maintained spacing between rescuers. One person disturbing a deposit could contaminate the next person's intake before the cloud became visible. The gap gave each of us enough time to stop if the field meter or particle alarm changed. Beyond the second station, every strand changed direction. Instead of lying southwest, the fibers pointed north toward the tube entrance. Wind still moved southwest across our suits. The glass ignored it and remained stretched against the airflow. Caleb measured the local electric field. The reading increased whenever one of us stepped forward and fell when we stopped. Dry glass and synthetic clothing can accumulate static, especially when particles rub against one another. The numbers were high but not impossible. Then a thin golden sheet rose from a crack beside Hannah. It curved toward her respirator, stopped several inches from the filter, and trembled in the air. When she held her breath, the sheet sagged. When she exhaled, it lifted again. We tested the response without moving our feet. Hannah turned her face slowly left, and the glass followed. Warm air from the respirator should have pushed the strands away. Instead, each exhalation pulled them closer, as if the space left after her breath carried a stronger force than the breath itself. The unnamed tube opened beneath a broken lava shelf ahead. Kalai's pack rested at the entrance with its shoulder straps cut cleanly through. Thousands of glass fibers entered the dark opening in a narrow stream, although the tube's measured airflow was coming out. We stopped outside the entrance and watched the stream through magnification. Individual fibers advanced in short movements. They lifted during each burst of air from the tube, then settled several inches deeper. Their progress resembled material pulled by a tide that instruments could not detect. Caleb placed an electric field probe near the opening. Charge rose and fell in a regular cycle. The timing did not match wind, gas pulses, or our equipment. It matched the breathing recorded on Kalai's last radio transmission. Static attraction offered a partial explanation. Human bodies, clothing, and powered equipment can create local electrical differences. Fine glass responds to small forces because it has little mass. Moist exhaled air also changes conductivity around a respirator and could reorganize nearby particles. That explanation failed at the entrance. The missing technicians were somewhere below, yet the fibers outside moved through an electric pattern shaped like breathing at the surface. The signal strengthened when we approached and weakened whenever all three of us stopped inhaling together. We inspected Kale's pack without lifting it. The cut straps had not been sliced by a tool. Dense glass had collected along two narrow lines and abraded the fabric until it separated. Golden threads filled the broken ends like wire inside a cable. Her spare filters remained sealed, but the package was punctured by hundreds of strands. A water bottle beside them had developed a soft leak where glass entered the plastic. The fibers were delicate individually. In parallel, they behaved like a fine saw. Kale's helmet camera was attached to the pack. Its final surface footage showed Owen clearing glass from a station housing with compressed air. The blast created a rolling cloud. Instead of dispersing downwind, the cloud folded around his arms and collected at the joints of his suit. He used water to rinse the material. Most fibers dropped immediately, but a dry strand remained stretched from his sleeve toward the tube. When he stepped away, more strands aligned behind it. The camera then followed both technicians toward the entrance. Gas readings inside the opening remained within our operational limits. Oxygen was normal, and sulfur dioxide stayed low. Temperature was elevated but stable. The immediate threat came from particles, visibility, sharp rock, and the unknown electrical behavior of the deposit. We attached a rope to old basalt beyond the entrance and entered one at a time. The passage descended under a ceiling of hardened lava. Its floor held loose clinker that shifted underfoot. Fibers covered the walls in narrow bands but left the center mostly clear. Caleb compared each bend with an older tube sketch. The entrance section matched, including a low shelf and two ceiling fractures. Deeper lines were incomplete because previous surveys had stopped where the passage narrowed and gas accumulated near the floor. Humidity increased several yards inside. Ordinary Pele's hair should have become heavier as moisture collected on it. The wall mats did sag. The narrow stream on the floor remained dry and continued moving deeper against the outward airflow. We found Owen's first route marker beneath a braid of glass. The fibers had wound around the reflective tab without moving its anchor. Another braid extended forward at chest height, suspended from no visible support. Its inside diameter matched a respirator hose. Hannah misted the braid with water. It collapsed instantly and broke into dark fragments. The field reading dropped near the wet area, then rose farther down the passage. Moisture controlled the material locally, but our supply could not saturate an entire tube. The rescue rope began vibrating behind us. Glass had collected where the line crossed the entrance lip and was cutting the sheath. Hannah protected the contact with copper mesh, then added a second line along a different angle. Neither rope could be considered permanent. We reported of damaged paths and established a pull signal for emergency withdrawal. Radio remained primary, but a contaminated microphone or a failed battery could silence us. 3 firm pulls meant the outside team would tension the cleaner line without waiting for explanation. My respirator alarm sounded after a short climb. The filter resistance had doubled even though no visible cloud surrounded me. Hannah inspected the intake and found a transparent layer pressed flat against the cartridge. It lifted and relaxed with my breathing like a second valve. We isolated the filter inside a wet evidence bag and installed a replacement. The obstruction continued pulsing after removal. Its rhythm slowed over several minutes but did not stop, although the bag contained no airflow from my mask. Farther inside, route tabs marked 2 directions at the same junction. Owen had placed one set. Kale had placed the other later. Both trails curved back toward the entrance on Caleb's survey, yet the physical passages descended away from it. A metallic impact traveled through the tube. 3 more followed at irregular intervals. Thermal imaging showed a warm area behind a low lava partition. The shape expanded with each impact, suggesting a person striking the rock from the other side. Between us and that partition, the floor stream rose into hundreds of vertical threads. Each strand bent toward our respirators. Together they formed 3 separate curves, one for every breathing person in the passage. We could not cross the vertical field while breathing normally. Hana connected our masks to small emergency cylinders and set them to controlled flow. The exhaust became steadier, reducing the sharp humidity changes around each breath. Caleb misted a narrow path while I advanced on the rope. Wet glass settled across my boots like golden mud. Dry strands above the spray twisted toward my shoulders and scraped the outer suit. Their contact produced tiny sparks visible in darkness. Each spark was weak, but the field meter climbed whenever several occurred together. The low partition opened into a chamber formed where the tube roof had partially collapsed. Kalai lay behind a slab with one arm through a gap. She had used Owen's metal tool case to strike the rock. Glass wrapped the case handle and connected it to the wall. Her respirator had stopped functioning. She was breathing through damp fabric held over her mouth and nose. A broken water container had kept the cloth and surrounding glass wet. The small patch of humidity created the only clear space around her face. Hannah reached her first and replaced the cloth with a positive pressure hood. I stabilized the slab while Caleb wetted every strand attached to it. Moving dry glass would release a cloud inside the chamber, so we converted each mat into a heavy mass before touching the rock. Kalai's ankle was trapped beneath the slab, but circulation remained present. We built a compact lifting system from the roof anchors and raised the stone only enough to free her. The chamber clicked with static throughout the lift, and golden threads crawled along the loaded ropes. Once clear, Kalai showed signs of dehydration, particle exposure, and a severe ankle injury. Her lungs sounded irritated but open. We irrigated her eyes, sealed contaminated clothing beneath a cover, and supplied humidified oxygen through the rescue hood. Small glass fragments had entered the cuffs of her gloves and produced dozens of shallow cuts. We did not remove them inside the tube. Exposing the skin would create new contamination, while aggressive wiping could drive invisible fibers deeper into tissue. She communicated by writing because speaking increased coughing. Owen had entered the tube after glass sealed his respirator intake. He believed higher humidity underground would make the fibers settle. For the first several yards, that plan worked. The fibers then began following the changing moisture around their masks. Owen removed his powered unit and used an emergency hood. A static discharge passed through the tool case, and the glass on the floor rose around them. The movement separated both technicians at the collapsed chamber. Owen continued through a narrow opening to draw the glass away from Kalai. He carried the remaining water mist and a gas meter. His last visible marker was beyond the chamber, descending toward a section not included in the recent airflow survey. Kalai had felt impacts through the rock after he disappeared. They repeated for almost an hour, then stopped. The glass surrounding her continued pulsing with his breathing rhythm before gradually changing to match her own. We sent her condition and account to Incident Command. The outside team could reach the chamber only if we secured the damaged entrance ropes and suppressed the particle field. Their arrival would take time, while Owen's emergency air supply was limited. Command confirmed that his cylinder should still contain air if the valve and hose remained intact. That estimate justified continuing. Without it, a second search would have exposed the team for a person who could no longer survive the delay. Hana remained with Kalai and prepared her for movement. Caleb and I continued under a strict search limit with spare cylinders, mist, rope, and medical equipment. We carried no loose fabric. Every buckle and tool was bonded to a common grounding line. The passage beyond the chamber forced us to crawl. Black lava scraped our helmets, and glass filled every hollow beneath our arms. We moved on wet paths that trapped particles and reduced friction against our suits. Caleb placed humidity markers at each junction. A safe return route would show damp glass and lower electric readings. Dry surfaces could no longer serve as landmarks because fiber bands shifted position whenever our breathing pattern changed. We found a strip from Owen's outer suit caught beneath a lava tooth. Its edge had been abraded into hundreds of parallel cuts. The strip pointed deeper, but the nearby fibers leaned back toward Kalai's chamber. Gas concentration rose in the lower passage. Carbon dioxide collected near the floor, while sulfur dioxide remained below our withdrawal limit. We kept our heads high and monitored each other for confusion, because an altered breathing pattern could be mistaken for panic or exhaustion. The field meter began pulsing faster than either of us breathed. A third rhythm had joined ours. It was weak, uneven, and interrupted by long pauses. We adjusted the direction of our search toward the strongest change. The signal ended at a choke point filled with broken lava datwarn. Beyond it, thermal imaging showed a small warm chamber. Golden fibers passed through gaps in the rubble and tightened during every third pulse. The choke point could not be cleared from the bottom. Removing loose blocks would release the larger slab above them. We searched the wall and found a narrow bypass formed by a drained lava blister. Caleb entered first and protected the sharp edge with a wet pad. The bypass opened above the warm chamber. Owen lay on a ledge beneath us, clipped to a corroded survey bolt. One emergency cylinder remained connected to his hood. The hose was wrapped in glass so densely that it resembled a golden rope. His breaths were shallow and irregular. Every inhalation tightened the fibers around the hose. Every exhalation loosened them slightly, but additional strands moved across the chamber floor and joined the bundle. The supply line was being compressed, one breath at a time. We could not cut the dry glass without releasing fragments around Owen's face. Caleb misted the bundle in short sections while I supported the hose. The fibers darkened, lost tension, and broke away in wet clumps. Airflow improved before we touched the hood seal. Owen responded to pressure on his shoulder but could not stand. He had fractured ribs, a dislocated shoulder, and cuts through both gloves. His oxygen saturation improved with a fresh cylinder. No signs suggested a spinal injury, but the narrow bypass prevented a normal litter extraction. The chamber contained the missing gas meter and mist unit. Both had been placed on a conductive plate from the monitoring station. Owen had grounded the equipment and himself to the survey bolt, creating a small area where fibers lay flat. His field notebook was sealed beneath the plate. The last entries compared filter resistance with electric charge and showed both rising together. A final diagram placed the grounded equipment between his breathing line and the densest glass. Outside that area, glass covered the floor in branching patterns. Each branch ended in a hollow oval surrounded by delicate loops. Caleb photographed them before wetting anything. The ovals matched the volume and spacing of Owen's recorded breaths. The deposit had preserved exhaled airflow as structure. Warm moisture should have collapsed the fibers, but the strands surrounding each hollow remained dry. They appeared to have arranged themselves along the boundary where humid breath met colder chamber air. Electrostatic forces, temperature gradients, and condensation could shape a temporary pattern. They could not explain why older hollows expanded and contracted after Owen's breathing slowed. Several continued moving in the rhythm he had used before losing consciousness. Caleb counted those rhythms while I treated Owen. The newest hollows matched his shallow breaths. Older structures maintained slower cycles recorded by his camera before the injury, preserving several stages of respiratory distress in the same deposit. Our water supply was no longer sufficient for both patients and the full return route. We reserved drinking and medical water, then combined the remaining mist units. The outside team began sending additional water down the protected entrance line in sealed bladders. The route through the choke had changed while we treated Owen. Fibers filled the bypass from floor to roof, forming a dense curtain. The chamber airflow pushed outward, yet the curtain bowed inward toward our masks. Caleb connected copper mesh to the grounded survey bolt and moved it toward the curtain. Nearby strands snapped onto the mesh. He dragged the sheet slowly, collecting glass the way a comb gathers hair. The field weakened behind it, but intensified at the ungrounded edge. We expanded the mesh into a shield and wetted its lower border. The combination gave the fibers two stronger paths than our respirators, electrical contact across the copper and moisture along the floor. It created a narrow lane through the curtain. Owen was secured in a flexible rescue wrap rather than a rigid litter. We protected his ribs, immobilized the shoulder, and routed his breathing hose beneath the wrap. I clipped him to my harness for the ascent through the bypass. Caleb moved the copper shield ahead while I pushed Owen upward. The glass followed the mesh in dense waves. Several strands crossed behind it and attached to my mask, but positive pressure prevented them from entering the intake. At the narrowest point, Owen's cylinder caught beneath the lava lip. I transferred his supply to my spare without removing the hood. The empty cylinder remained behind because turning it would have damaged the hose and delayed the rescue. We cleared the choke as the third breathing rhythm disappeared from the field meter. Owen was still breathing. The missing signal came from the chamber behind us, where the hollow glass patterns had stopped moving at the same moment. Hana met us near Kalai's shelter with the forward members of the outside team. They had stabilized the entrance ropes and delivered water. Both patients could now be moved together, reducing the number of breathing groups that the fibers could separate. Our exit plan used a grounded copper shield at the front, continuous mist at ankle height, and humidified positive pressure hoods for everyone. We would retreat in one connected line and abandon any equipment that increased static or obstructed the patients. The expanded team gave us more hands, but also more breathing, heat, and electrical charge. We paired each rescuer with a single task. Nobody adjusted a mask, rope, or patient without another person controlling the surrounding glass. Kalai traveled in the rigid litter because of her ankle and exposure. Owen remained in the flexible wrap for the narrow passage. Medical attendants watched both breathing systems while Hana controlled the order of movement. The first water bladders created a damp route through the collapsed chamber. Fibers settled where spray touched them and clung to the ground. Dry glass along the ceiling continued bending toward our hoods, but the copper shield intercepted most strands before contact. We divided the exit into short stages based on water use rather than distance. At each stop, we checked filter resistance, gas levels, rope condition, patient status, and electric field strength. A safe-looking passage could become impassable after only a few dry breaths. Each stage ended beside a roof feature strong enough to accept an anchor. If a patient's system failed, the litter could remain suspended above contaminated glass, while attendants changed cylinders or repaired a hood without placing anyone on the floor. Humidity dropped as we climbed toward the surface. The same airflow that carried volcanic gases outward also dried our route behind us. Wet glass began separating into sharp fragments. Anyone who fell would drive those fragments through protective clothing. The tube's convection changed near midday. Warm air that had been leaving the entrance slowed and began drawing cooler air inward along the floor. Dry surface fibers entered with it, collecting against the damp trail in thick bands. Caleb rotated the copper shield so its grounded edge faced the new flow. The strands attached in layers until the mesh became heavy. We could not shake it clean. Instead, we folded the contaminated section inward and exposed fresh copper. The first patient crossing went smoothly. Kalai's litter remained above the wet path, and her breathing hood maintained pressure. Owen followed through the low section with 2 rescuers supporting his wrap and 1 carrying the cylinder beside him. The lead missed nozzle then failed. A glass fragment had entered the valve and cut its seal. Water leaked into the operator's glove instead of reaching the floor. Dry fibers began rising around the shield while Hannah replaced the unit. I used a drinking bladder with a punctured cap to wet the immediate route. The stream was uneven but sufficient to collapse the lowest strands. We lost part of our reserved water, forcing command to send another bladder down the rope. A static arc crossed between the copper shield and a metal buckle. The flash was small and produced no fire. Its electrical effect traveled through the dry deposit. Every fiber on the ceiling lifted at once and pointed toward the rescue line. The air filled with gold. Visibility fell below the length of my arm. Respirator alarms sounded in sequence as glass reached the filters. We stopped moving, maintained positive pressure, and pressed wet pads over the outer intakes without blocking airflow. 1 rescuer's powered unit failed completely. Hannah placed an emergency hood over the existing mask and connected it to Owen's empty reserve line, now supplied from a shared cylinder. Removing contaminated equipment inside the cloud would have exposed the rescuer's face. Caleb lowered the shield onto the wet floor and grounded it with both ropes. Fibers descended toward the mesh, clearing a dark space above us. The copper could no longer lead the team, but it gave us enough visibility to reach the final passage. We moved without stopping. Mateo's outside crew hauled Kalai's litter through the entrance while we guided it over the broken lip. Owen followed on the flexible wrap. The surface wind pulled loose glass across the opening in sheets. Outside, tangled rolls of Pele's hair crossed the route like dry brush. They moved downwind until our breathing line approached, then turned toward us. The decontamination team used broad water fans to pin each roll against the lava. We advanced inside that moving corridor of spray. Water struck our suits, carried glass downward, and pooled inside shallow cracks. The fibers lost their golden color when wet, becoming nearly invisible against black rock. Both patients reached the clean zone before our remaining cylinders fell below reserve. Outer suits were cut away under water spray. Filters were sealed, and every exposed abrasion was irrigated. Nobody removed eye protection until particle counts dropped. Decontamination water was captured rather than allowed to run back toward the closure. Wet glass remained sharp and could dry again. Every discarded layer entered a rigid container, and respirator cartridges were handled as evidence instead of ordinary medical waste. From the road, the tube entrance looked empty. Then the dry glass still surrounding it rose into 2 narrow columns. One pulsed rapidly, the other slowly, preserving the breathing patterns of Kalai and Owen after both were gone. Kalai remained hospitalized for respiratory irritation and surgery on her ankle. Owen required treatment for his shoulder, ribs, and extensive glass injuries to both hands. Both eventually returned to modified duty. No rescuer developed permanent lung damage. The closure remained in place while investigators documented the tube. Teams entered only after heavy natural rain had settled surface fibers. They recovered Owen's cylinder, the damaged mist unit, route markers, cameras, glass samples, and the copper shield. Most findings had ordinary causes. Pele's hair is lightweight volcanic glass capable of traveling far on wind. It collects in low areas, forms mats, abrades material, and harms skin, eyes, and respiratory systems. Static charge can influence fine particles. Laboratory tests confirmed that dry fibers responded to electrical fields produced by clothing and equipment. Humidity reduced charge, while grounded copper attracted the glass more strongly than protected human bodies. Those results validated the methods that allowed us to escape. Microscopy found no unusual mineral, organism, or coating. The strands were ordinary basaltic glass in composition and structure. Whatever distinguished the active samples could not be identified by examining a fiber after it had stopped moving. Airflow models also recreated several hollow shapes. Warm, humid breath. Entering cooler air can define boundaries where particles collect. Under controlled conditions, researchers produced crude oval structures around a breathing simulator. The models failed after the simulator stopped. Their structures collapsed immediately, or remained motionless. Samples from the tube continued expanding and contracting for hours, retaining the breathing cadence of the person who had occupied each chamber. Camera timestamps allowed investigators to identify separate rhythms. One matched Kalai, another matched Owen, and several matched rescuers. The patterns did not change when samples were moved, rotated, grounded, or placed in still air. Sealed evidence bags presented the same response. Fibers removed from my failed filter pulsed at my resting rate for nearly a day. When I entered the laboratory, the rhythm accelerated before any door opened between us. Independent facilities repeated the tests using new containers and isolated rooms. Ordinary glass remained still. Material from the tube oriented toward nearby breathing subjects through barriers that blocked airflow and visible light. No accepted mechanism explained that behavior. The final report described persistent particle alignment associated with changing humidity and charge. It did not claim that glass remembered breath. It also did not offer another reason the rhythms remained individual. Field procedures changed after heavy fallout. Teams now carry conductive shields, redundant positive pressure hoods, water mist, and protected root lines. Any glass deposit aligned against measured wind is treated as active until moisture and electrical readings confirm otherwise. Training also prohibits compressed air around accumulated fibers. Blowing a mat, clear, can turn a surface hazard into a respirable cloud and distribute charge across equipment. Water or controlled collection is used even when the deposit appears thin. The unnamed tube was sealed with a barrier that allowed natural airflow, but prevented entry. Monitoring instruments remained outside. They recorded gas, humidity, particle movement, and electric fields without requiring anyone to cross the deposit. For months, the readings stayed normal. Rain buried much of the surface glass. New vegetation caught scattered fibers, and ordinary wind stripped the entrance clean. The incident gradually became another restricted case taught during respiratory protection training. One sealed sample remained in the incident room. It contained the transparent layer removed from my first clogged filter. The jar sat inside a grounded cabinet with humidity control and no connection to the building ventilation. During annual training, I brought the jar out to show how little glass could stop a powered respirator. The layer looked like clear film until several people gathered around it. Then fine strands lifted from the bottom and leaned toward the nearest face. We repeated the observation from different sides. The fibers did not follow heat, movement, or spoken sound. They leaned toward each person during inhalation and relaxed during exhalation, even when the jar was placed behind a solid partition. The sample was returned to the cabinet with an independent camera and pressure sensor. Both seals remained intact overnight. No airflow, vibration, or humidity change appeared in the record. Shortly before dawn, the fibers rose and formed several hollow ovals. Most expanded in the rhythms of people who had stood near the jar during training. One pattern was slower and deeper than any breathing record collected that day. I reviewed the video alone and counted every rise of the glass against my own breath. When I stopped breathing, the strands continued moving. There was one more breath inside the jar than there was in the room. Winter hides the most dangerous parts of Lassen beneath the cleanest surface. Snow covers roads, trails, warning signs, steam vents, and ground thin enough to break under a boot. A white slope can conceal cold rock, boiling mud, or nothing solid at all. I had worked at Lassen Volcanic for 10 winters when the snow began rising and falling above a closed hydrothermal basin. The movement was too small to notice from a distance. Up close, it resembled the pulse visible beneath skin. The incident began after a storm added several feet to the southwest area. Wind loaded gullies and buried exposed sections of the park road. The public winter route to Sulphur Works remained open, but every hydrothermal area beyond maintained access was closed. 2 park technicians entered a restricted monitoring corridor under a written operations plan. Serena Holt maintained thermal sensors. Devin Rivas inspected gas lines and remote cameras. Both had avalanche training, winter travel experience, and authorization to work near hydrothermal ground. Their route stayed on a line surveyed before snowfall. Flexible markers identified buried anchors and stable volcanic rock. They carried skis, probes, ropes, avalanche beacons, satellite messengers, gas monitors, burn supplies, and emergency insulation. Their assignment was to restore a station that had stopped transmitting after the storm. The instrument sat outside the active basin on an old service platform. Reaching it required crossing snow above cold bedrock, not walking over any known vent or pool. Before departure, the technicians reviewed the most recent thermal survey with incident staff. Nothing showed heat beneath the approved approach. The nearest mapped vent remained well inside the closure, separated from the service line by volcanic ground that had been cold during every previous winter inspection. Serena's first check-in reported deep but stable snow. The next included a thermal image showing a narrow, warm line beneath the route. She believed runoff had entered an old drainage and requested time to mark the feature before returning. Minutes later, the station transmitted a sequence of temperature spikes. They arrived at regular intervals instead of rising gradually. Each spike began near the technicians and traveled outward through several buried sensors like a pulse moving along a branching vessel. Their satellite tracks separated. Devin remained near the service platform. Serena moved east across ground outside the surveyed corridor, stopped, then returned to the same location several times. Her final position appeared inside the hydrothermal closure. Dispatch contacted both radios. Devin's unit sent an open carrier containing steam and a repeated low impact. Serena's transmitted only once. The signal contained rapid breathing, a gas alarm, and a scraping sound before ending. I joined Ranger Nia Franklin and geophysicist Dr. Adrian Liu at the Southwest Incident Post. Nia directed technical rescue and winter medicine. Adrian had designed part of the thermal network. I managed navigation, atmospheric readings, and communication. Command assigned a separate observer to compare our live locations with the buried sensor grid. That person would not interpret visible terrain or rescue decisions. The only responsibility was identifying heat or pressure changes that our team could not see from the surface. We carried skis, flotation, snowshoes, ropes, pickets, thermal cameras, ground radar, long probes, gas detectors, breathing hoods, burn dressings, and a rescue sled. A second team remained on known roadbed with a winch and warming shelter. The warming shelter contained separate supplies for burns, hypothermia, and gas exposure because the treatments could conflict. Extra cylinders and dry insulation were staged along the road so an evacuation team would never depend on equipment carried into the basin. Avalanche conditions were manageable along our selected approach. The larger danger came from heat below. Snow near hydrothermal features can look firm while hiding acidic water, steam cavities, or thin crust. We treated every warm reading as unsupported ground. Our movement rule was simple. No one advanced from one confirmed anchor until the next point was tested by probe, radar, and thermal imaging. Existing ski tracks proved where somebody had traveled. They did not prove the route still existed. The public route ended where steam kept part of the buried road exposed. Beyond the closure, snow rose into smooth drifts between dark trees. Devin and Serena's outward tracks remained visible for several hundred yards. Wind had strengthened since their departure, but it could not explain the preserved tracks beside erased sections. Where the thermal lines crossed, old ski marks had risen into smooth ridges. Between those lines, fine details from the technician's bindings remained sharp. Raw. Near the first monitoring stake, both ski lines curved around a shallow depression. Thermal imaging showed no vent beneath it. The center was colder than surrounding snow, yet its surface lifted slowly against gravity. Adrian placed a vibration sensor beside the depression. The snow rose, paused, and settled. A second movement followed less than a second later. The timing matched the thermal spikes recorded after the technicians disappeared. The pattern spread beneath us. A warm line advanced under the snow, divided around our skis, and joined again behind us. The surface moved in sequence along that line, not like wind or settling snow, but like pressure traveling through a flexible tube. At the service platform, Devon's pole stood upright beside an empty hole. His safety rope entered the snow and tightened with every pulse. Steam escaped around it in short bursts, each carrying the smell of sulfur. We anchored the rope to exposed rock before touching it. Nia applied gentle tension while Adrian scanned the hole. Radar showed a shallow chamber beneath the snow roof, and a larger liquid return below it. The original service platform had tilted toward the cavity. Thermal imaging could not separate a person from hot ground. Nearly everything beneath the opening glowed. We used an acoustic probe instead, sending controlled taps through the snow. A weak response returned from the far side of the chamber. The probe also measured the time between each tap and its return. The cavity changed dimensions during every pulse, confirming that a fixed opening could narrow around a trapped person before rescuers reached it. Devon's rope had cut into the roof and disappeared beneath a lip of hard ice. Pulling directly would saw through the remaining support. Nia protected the edge with a wide rescue board and redirected the load through a pulley anchored to rock. We widened the opening from the cold side. Steam condensed on our goggles and froze along their edges. Gas readings rose whenever a pressure pulse crossed the chamber, then fell as the snow settled. We worked during the low intervals. Devon appeared beneath the tilted platform with his upper body above a muddy pool. One ski had caught across the opening and prevented him from falling deeper. His harness remained attached to the rope, but the line pressed across his injured shoulder. He was conscious and able to follow instructions. His outer clothing was wet from steam and meltwater. One leg had been burned below the knee, while the other showed signs of cold injury. Alternating heat and exposure had damaged him in opposite ways. Treating both injuries required restraint. Rapidly warming the cold foot risked further tissue damage if it froze again, while cooling the burned leg too aggressively would deepen his hypothermia. Nia protected each limb separately and focused first on airway, breathing, and core insulation. Nia lowered a breathing hood because each pulse released more gas into the cavity. Adrian stabilized the platform with a second line. I entered on a board supported from both sides, keeping my weight away from the warm roof. The trapped ski could not be lifted without shifting Devon toward the pool. I cut the binding and removed his boot first. Nia maintained traction on the harness while I rotated the broken ski free from the ice. A stronger pulse struck during the extraction. Mud rose beneath Devon and splashed the platform. The snow roof expanded upward, lifting the rescue board several inches. Our anchors held, but the opening changed shape around my legs. The gas detector peaked at the same moment. My breathing hood maintained clean air, but visibility vanished inside condensed steam. I kept one hand locked around Devon's harness and followed rope tension instead of sight until the vapor cleared. We pulled Devon onto the cold side and transferred him to the sled. His breathing improved outside the cavity. Nia covered the burn without rubbing or rapidly warming the cold foot. Both injuries required controlled treatment away from the hydrothermal zone. Devon explained the separation through brief written answers. The warm line appeared beneath their route after they reached the station. Each time they stopped, the pulse spread outward and opened a new steam hole nearby. Serena saw their return corridor begin sagging and moved east to place a marker. The ground behind her rose while the route ahead remained smooth. She continued toward a buried section of the old service line where fixed anchors should have provided support. Devon followed until the platform failed beneath him. Serena returned, secured his rope, and tried to reach the road team by radio. A gas burst forced her away before she could finish the rescue. Her last visible direction matched the branch recorded by the thermal network. Devon had felt pulses moving beneath the snow after she disappeared. They slowed whenever he became still and accelerated during his attempts to climb. We established a patient shelter on exposed roadbed and sent his condition to medical control. The second team began moving the sled toward the warming station. Devon was alive, but delay would increase tissue damage and inhalation risk. His evacuation line remained separate from the search anchors. If the hydrothermal surface failed again, a collapsing search route could not pull the patient sled backward. The winch team used short, controlled movements and stopped whenever his circulation or breathing changed. Serena remained missing inside a zone where the thermal pattern was expanding. Nia assigned 2 rescuers to Devon and kept the rest of us on the search. We retained the sled rope, gas equipment, radar, and enough medical gear for 1 additional patient. Adrian downloaded the damaged station. Subsurface temperature usually changed slowly, reflecting steam and water movement. The new data showed narrow heat fronts traveling through the snowpack at nearly identical intervals. The fronts were not moving through rock. Sensors beneath the snow remained steady. Heat traveled inside branching cavities between the snow and the ground, where steam condensed, pressurized the voids, and escaped through weak points. Water collected in the lowest spaces and briefly sealed some vents. Pressure rose until a seal failed, sending steam into the next cavity. That cycle could create repeated surges, but Adrian had never recorded one maintaining a precise interval across so many branches. One branch curved east along Serena's route. It pulsed faster than the others and ended beneath a field of untouched snow. No ski track crossed the surface, although her final position lay beyond it. We approached the untouched field from cold bedrock. Probes entered dense snow for several feet, then dropped into open space. The void extended farther than our poles could reach, and separated us from Serena's last signal. Radar showed a network of narrow chambers beneath the white surface. Their roofs rose and fell with each pressure cycle. Several connected to known vents, while others crossed areas previously mapped as cold ground. The snowpack had become a temporary plumbing system. Steam traveled through low spaces above the earth, melting channels and sealing them with refrozen crust. Pressure moved through those channels faster than heat could spread through solid snow. Adrian estimated that several cavities had formed only after the storm. Deep snow insulated the ground, while new weight compressed older voids and redirected steam laterally. A passage safe during the previous survey could become unsupported without any change visible from above. That process explained the pulse. It did not explain the rhythm. Geothermal pressure fluctuates, but it does not normally divide around moving people, pause when they stop, or accelerate after their breathing changes. We placed anchors behind us and extended a lightweight bridge across the first void. The bridge spread weight over colder edges. Adrian crossed with radar, while Nia controlled his line from rock. Each bridge component was tethered before placement. Losing a board into a steam cavity would reduce our return options and could splash acidic water onto the team. We worked from knees and hips to distribute pressure, never standing upright on an unverified plate. The next surface appeared firm, but produced no resistance beneath its upper crust. Thermal imaging showed branching warmth below it. Every branch contracted toward our bridge during the same part of the cycle. We avoided the warm lines and moved between colder nodes. Those spaces were not entirely safe. Cold snow could hide a deep cavity no longer connected to steam. Each placement still required radar and probe confirmation. Serena's route marker emerged from the snow ahead. Its flexible pole leaned east, but the buried anchor cable ran west beneath the surface. The marker had been pushed upward from below without tearing free. Her radio lay beside it under a thin layer of ice. The housing was warm, and the microphone contained condensed water. The final stored transmission showed her gas alarm rising and falling at the same rate as the thermal pulse. A second alarm appeared on our detectors. Carbon dioxide increased near the snow while hydrogen sulfide remained variable. We fitted breathing hoods and kept cylinders ready, because smell could not reliably warn us of changing gas. The instruments were carried at different heights. Heavy carbon dioxide could collect near a trapped person while readings at chest level remained acceptable. A low sampling tube descended through each probe hole before anyone placed a face near the opening. Thermal imaging found a cold oval beyond the marker. It could have been a person insulated by snow or an empty pocket protected from steam. Radar showed a dense object inside, positioned above a deeper warm channel. The oval remained cold during 2 passing pulses, suggesting that insulation separated it from the hot channel. A living person might survive there, but the same insulation would also prevent steam from revealing an exact body shape to our camera. We called Serena's name and received no answer. Nia struck an anchor plate 3 times. After several seconds, 2 impacts returned from beneath the cold oval. The response repeated but weakened each time. The safest opening lay on the uphill side, where snow remained thick and gas moved away from us. We constructed a platform with crossed boards and tied every rescuer to separate anchors. I cut through the upper crust with a snow saw. The layer below was wet and granular, then abruptly hollow. Cold air escaped before a warm pulse replaced it, carrying carbon dioxide into our work area. Serena was inside the cavity on a narrow shelf of volcanic rock. She had removed her skis and used them to brace the roof. One arm held an emergency hood against her face. The cylinder indicator was near empty. Her right leg hung over a steaming channel. The boot had softened from heat, but the skin above it remained protected. She was hypothermic, confused, and unable to climb through the opening without assistance. Nia entered with a fresh breathing supply and secured Serena to a harness. Adrian monitored the roof. I extended a rigid board beneath her leg to prevent contact with the hot channel during the lift. The next pulse arrived early. The cavity roof lifted against our platform, then dropped farther than before. Serena's ski braces bent. Cracks traveled from the opening toward every warm branch visible on the thermal camera. We raised Serena through the hole before the roof settled again. The steaming channel expanded beneath the shelf and consumed the place where she had been lying. Her abandoned skis disappeared into muddy water. Serena remained conscious after extraction but could not recall how long she had been trapped. Her gas exposure caused headache and confusion. Nia replaced wet layers, supplied oxygen, immobilized the heated boot, and insulated her from the snow. The route back to cold bedrock had changed. 2 voids connected beneath our bridge, turning its center support into an unsupported island. The original anchors remained secure, but the surface between them moved with each pulse. Snow displaced by the connected cavities had nowhere to settle normally. It folded upward along the bridge edges and created firm-looking ridges. Those ridges carried almost no load, despite appearing denser than the surrounding surface. We could not wait for the pattern to stabilize. Steam was enlarging the cavities, and Serena's condition required evacuation. The second team had already taken Devon toward the incident post, leaving our group with 1 patient and limited bridge material. Adrian mapped pressure timing from the sensor network. Each cycle traveled outward from a point below the damaged station, divided into branches, and returned toward the center. The low-pressure interval lasted long enough to move the sled across one tested span. We converted the rigid boards into a narrow litter and attached 2 independent haul lines. Nia controlled Serena's airway and insulation. Adrian called pressure intervals. I selected anchors and verified the next route. We documented every anchor load and patient movement by radio. If the surface separated the team, the road observer could reconstruct our last stable configuration. That record also prevented a later rescuer from mistaking abandoned equipment for a safe route. Our first movement crossed the cavity where we found her. The boards flexed, but remained supported at both ends. We reached the marker island before the warm branches contracted beneath us. The second span failed during testing. A probe entered firm snow. Then the entire plate tilted into a steam channel. Acidic mud splashed the empty board and discolored its surface. We abandoned that direction without placing anyone on it. The only remaining route followed a buried line of old service anchors north. Their cables were not designed as rescue supports, but each foundation extended into volcanic rock. We exposed them one at a time from the cold side. Corrosion and hidden heat made every anchor questionable until tested. We loaded each point gradually while watching surrounding snow for movement. Any anchor that transmitted vibration into a warm branch was rejected, even if the exposed metal appeared undamaged. The route brought us closer to the center of the pulse. Thermal lines surrounded the anchor chain like vessels around bone. Their movement became visible without a camera as the snow lifted in branching ridges. Serena's heart rate increased whenever the ridges approached. The thermal pulses accelerated with it. When oxygen and insulation calmed her, the underground rhythm slowed by nearly the same amount. Nia verified the pulse manually after moving the electronic monitor away from the thermal equipment. Adrian used a separate mechanical timer. The correlation remained, ruling out shared electrical interference between the medical sensor and the geophysical network. Adrian compared both records and found no delay between them. A response moving through snow and steam should require time. The pressure network changed at the same moment as the pulse measured at Serena's wrist. We did not use that correlation to guide medical care. Slowing a patient for the terrain would be reckless. Nia treated Serena according to her condition while the route team adapted to whatever rhythm followed. At the third anchor, the haul line began sinking into warm snow. Heat softened its sheath and moisture froze farther back, locking the rope inside a narrow channel. Continued pulling would have redirected the litter toward the vent. I secured a replacement line and cut the trapped section. The freed end vanished beneath the snow with a violent tug. Thermal imaging showed its path moving toward the center of the network, as if the pulse had drawn it inward. We reached the damaged service platform from the opposite side. Devon's cavity had widened into an open pool. The exposed roadbed remained beyond it, separated from us by broken snow and steam. The winch team could reach our anchors from the road but had no stable line of travel for rescuers. We needed to move Serena across the open pool without loading its edges. A highline offered the only route. Before tensioning, we tested both sides with loads heavier than the patient. The near anchor shifted slightly and was replaced with 2 points equalized into exposed rock. The far team protected its rope from the heated edge with metal rollers. Nia anchored one side to volcanic rock. The road team secured the other to the winch vehicle. We tensioned twin ropes above the pool and attached the litter at 2 points to prevent rotation. Steam obscured the far team whenever a pulse opened the pool. Communication moved through radio and rope signals. Every command was repeated before the litter left an anchor. As Serena was clipped to the highline, the snow around us began pulsing at her current heart rate. A second, slower rhythm appeared beneath the open pool, continuing after Devon had already left the basin. The litter entered the high line during a low-pressure interval. Nia traveled beside Serena on a separate attachment. Adrian monitored gas and thermal movement while I controlled the tagline from the anchor island. Halfway across, a steam burst struck the underside of the litter. The ropes lifted and began oscillating. Nia shielded Serena's face while the road team stopped hauling until the system settled. The slower thermal rhythm moved beneath the pool and reached our anchor. Snow fractured around the exposed rock, revealing that part of the island rested on a thin mineral crust rather than continuous bedrock. I transferred the tagline to a second anchor before the first shifted. Adrian crossed next, carrying only instruments and emergency breathing supply. Everything else remained on the island. My turn began as the faster rhythm contracted toward the pool. The high line remained clear, but the takeoff ledge dropped several inches. Acidic water entered the cracks and steamed against cold snow. I clipped onto the system and released the failing anchor. The road team hauled while I kept my boots above the pool. A warm burst struck from below and coated my outer layer with muddy spray. The mineral crust collapsed after I cleared it. Boards, packs, and the cut rope fell together. The pulse spread outward in a visible ring, lifting snow across the basin before disappearing beneath the trees. Serena reached the warming shelter with a stable airway and improving mental status. Her leg had heat damage but no full-thickness burn. The team removed contaminated outer layers and began transport toward definitive care. We remained long enough to account for every rescuer and piece of critical equipment. No person returned for abandoned gear. Hydrothermal pools had already consumed the route, and recovery could wait until snow melted. The thermal station continued transmitting. One rhythm followed Serena toward the road and weakened as distance increased. The slower rhythm remained beneath the open pool, repeating without any patient nearby. Adrian overlaid that slower pattern with Devon's medical record from the cavity. It matched his resting heart rate before injury, not the elevated rate measured during rescue. The basin had retained an earlier version of his pulse. We disabled the remote station only after copying its data. Leaving damaged power equipment near gas and water created an additional hazard. The sensors continued recording locally for later recovery. Weather deteriorated before sunset. Snow filled our approach tracks and covered the outer edges of the pool. By morning, the basin again appeared smooth, white, and untouched from the road. Both patients reached the hospital by ground ambulance. No helicopter could have lifted them safely through cloud, steam, and forest. Their survival depended on fixed anchors, controlled loads, gas protection, and refusing to trust a surface because it looked calm. The ambulance route was longer because storm debris blocked the direct road. Medical teams used that time to stabilize temperature and breathing rather than rushing damaged limbs. Neither patient was rewarmed faster than the receiving hospital could safely continue. During transport, Devon and Serena's medical monitors were synchronized with the station clock. Neither hospital staff nor investigators knew why that detail would matter, but it preserved an independent record of both heart rates after they left the basin. The team returned to the visitor center after decontamination. When I removed my boots, meltwater had collected beneath one sole. The water trembled in two rhythms, although the room floor was still. I sealed the boots in water for investigators. The movement stopped after the sample cooled. A thermal camera showed no heat source inside the container. Chain of custody photographs showed the container remaining still through transport. It trembled again only when placed beside the downloaded station recorder, although neither object emitted measurable heat, sound, or radio energy. That night, the sensor network sent one final packet before losing power. Warm lines beneath the basin formed a closed branching pattern around the empty rescue route. The pattern narrowed where each person had stopped, widened where we had carried the litter, and converged at the two cavities where Devon and Serena had been found. At its center, the slower pulse continued alone. Devon recovered after treatment for burns, cold injury, and gas exposure. Serena required surgery to repair damaged tissue in her lower leg. Both returned to work months later but no longer entered winter hydrothermal closures. The investigation waited until snowmelt exposed stable access. Engineers, geologists, and rescue specialists surveyed the basin from marked routes. They recovered sensors, anchors, damaged ropes, boards, cameras, and the remains of the service platform. Much of the event followed known hazards. Snow can conceal acidic boiling water and mud it. Steam can hollow spaces beneath a surface that appears solid. Carbon dioxide and hydrogen sulfide can collect or pulse as pressure changes. The storm had provided deep snow, while hydrothermal heat created cavities below it. Repeated condensation and refreezing formed temporary roofs. Pressure changes moved through connected spaces and collapsed several sections during our rescue. Those processes explain the hidden voids, gas bursts changing route, and warm lines. They did not explain the consistent rhythms or their immediate relationship to individual heart rates. Medical timestamps were compared with thermal data. Every major change in Serena's pulse appeared simultaneously across the branching snow network. Devon's earlier resting rhythm continued after he left and remained active until the station failed. Investigators tested the basin the following winter using pumps that produced controlled pressure cycles. The snow rose and settled, but the response dispersed with distance. No pattern divided around people or retained a previous frequency. Test participants changed positions without informing the pump operators. Pressure followed the program channels instead of the people, exactly as ordinary mechanics predicted. The difference made the rescue data harder to dismiss as our frightened interpretation of moving snow. All tests were performed from fixed platforms with observers blind to the programmed rhythm. Instruments correctly recorded the artificial pulses, proving that the sensor network could distinguish ordinary pressure movement from the synchronized pattern preserved during rescue. They added heated mannequins, moving loads, and recorded heart vibrations. None created a synchronized network. Natural steam overwhelmed the tiny mechanical energy produced by a pulse through clothing and snow. The final report described an unresolved coupling between subnivean pressure, heat transfer, and human movement. It excluded equipment error because separate instruments recorded the same pattern. It did not address why the system copied biological rhythms. Reviewers agreed only on the operational facts. The pulses anticipated no equipment failure and provided no safe path. Treating them as communication would have encouraged rescuers to follow a pattern that repeatedly led toward thinner ground. Winter procedures changed. No employee enters a snow-covered hydrothermal monitoring corridor without radar, independent anchors, gas protection, and remote thermal observation. A smooth surface above known heat is treated as a roof, not ground. The damaged service station was not rebuilt in the basin. New instruments were installed on exposed volcanic rock and read from the road. The interior sensors remained buried because recovering them would require crossing fragile hydrothermal terrain. For 2 winters, the remote system showed ordinary steam movement. Warm areas expanded after storms and shrank during clear, cold weather. No repeating pulse appeared, and the closed basin remained undisturbed. Staff avoided turning the absence of new activity into reassurance. Hydrothermal hazards remained real without anything unexplained. The closure stayed in force because deep snow and thin ground were sufficient reasons, even if the rhythmic event never returned. During the 3rd winter, a ranger noticed a narrow, warm line on the overnight thermal feed. It began beneath the old Devon cavity and traveled north under the buried road. The line crossed every former anchor location without branching. When it reached the visitor center foundation, the camera lost it beneath exposed pavement. No vent or utility pipe connected the basin to the building. Facilities inspected the floor and found normal temperature, Gas readings were clear. The building remained open while additional sensors were installed beneath the incident room. Those sensors activated after staff left for the night. A pressure change moved under the concrete, paused beneath the table holding the old rescue map, and began repeating at a slow, steady interval. The interval matched Devon's resting pulse from the first station record. But a second rhythm joined it before dawn. That one matched Serena's heart rate after we stabilized her in the snow. I arrived to review the data, and felt nothing unusual until I placed my hand on the map table. The metal legs vibrated softly beneath my fingers, alternating between the two recorded rhythms. Then both rhythms stopped. A third pulse answered from beneath my boots, keeping perfect time with the heart inside my chest.